Section 17 of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6, by Giorgio Vasari, translated by Gaston de C. de VERE. Section 17. Perino del Vaga. Life of Perino del Vaga, Painter of Florence. Part 1. A truly great gift is art, who, paying no regard to abundance of riches, to high estate, or to nobility of blood, embraces, protects, and uplifts from the ground a child of poverty much more often than one wrapped in the ease of wealth. And this heaven does in order to show how much power the influences of its stars and constellations have over us, distributing more of its favors to one, and to another less. Which influences are, for the most part, the reason that we mortals come to be born with dispositions more or less fiery or sluggish, weak or strong, fierce or gentle, fortunate or unfortunate, and richer or poorer in talent. And whoever has any doubt of this will be enlightened in this present life of Perino del Vaga, a painter of great excellence and genius. This Perino, the son of a poor father, having been left an orphan as a little child and abandoned by his relatives, was guided and governed by art, whom he always acknowledged as his true mother and honored without ceasing. And the studies of the art of painting were pursued by him with such zeal and diligence that he was enabled in due time to execute those noble and famous decorations which have brought so much glory to Genoa and to Prince Doria. Wherefore we may believe without a doubt that it is heaven that raises men from those infinite depths in which they were born to that summit of greatness to which they ascend, when they prove by laboring valiantly at their works that they are true followers of the sciences that they have chosen to learn. Even as Perino chose and pursued as his vocation the art of design, in which he proved himself full of grace and most excellent, or rather absolutely perfect. And he not only equaled the ancients in stucco work, but also equaled the best modern craftsmen in the whole field of painting, displaying all the excellence that could possibly be desired in a human intellect that seeks, in solving the difficulties of that art, to achieve beauty, grace, charm, and delicacy with coloring, and with every other kind of ornament. But let us speak more particularly of his origin. There lived in the city of Florence one Giovanni Buonaccorsi, who entered the service of Charles VIII, King of France, and fought in his wars, and being a spirited and open-handed young man, spent all that he possessed in that service and in gaming, and finally lost his life therein. To him was born a son who received the name of Piero. And this son, after being left as an infant of 2 months old without his mother, who died of plague, was reared in the greatest misery at a farm, being suckled by a goat until his father, having gone to Bologna, took as his second wife a woman whose husband and children had died of plague. And she, with her plague-infected milk, finished nursing Piero, who was now called Pierino, a pet name such as it is a general custom to give to little children, and retained that name ever afterwards. He was then taken to Florence by his father, who, on returning to France, left him with some relatives, and they, either because they had not the means or because they would not accept the burdensome charge of maintaining him, and having him taught some ingenious vocation, placed him with the apothecary of the Pina d'Oro, to the end that he might learn that calling. But, not liking that profession, he was taken as shopboy by the painter Andrea de Ceri, who was pleased with the air and the ways of Perino, and thought that he saw in him a certain lively spirit of intelligence from which it might be hoped that in time some good fruits would issue from him. Andrea was no great painter, quite commonplace indeed, and one of those who stand openly and publicly in their workshops, executing any kind of work, however mean. And he was wont to paint every year for the festival of San Gian certain wax tapers which were carried as offerings, as they still are, together with the other tributes of the city, for which reason he was called Andrea de Ceri, and from that name Perino was afterwards called for some time Perino de Ceri. Andrea then took care of Perino for some years, teaching him the rudiments of art as well as he could, but when the boy had reached the age of 11 he was forced to seek for him some master better than himself, and so, having a straight friendship with Rodolfo, the son of Domenico Ghirlandaio, who, as will be related, was held to be able and well practiced in painting, Andrea de Cero placed Perino with him, to the end that he might give his attention to design, and strive with all the zeal and love at his command to make in that art the proficience of which his great genius gave promise. Whereupon, pursuing his studies among the many young men whom Rodolfo had in his workshop, all engaged in learning art, in a short time Perino came to surpass all the rest, so great were his ardor and his eagerness. Among them was one named Toto del Nunziata, who was to him as a spur to urge him on continually, which Toto, likewise attaining in time to equality with the finest intellects, departed from Florence and made his way with some Florentine merchants to England, where he executed all his works, and was very richly rewarded by the king of that country, whom he also served in architecture, erecting in particular his principal palace. He and Perino, then, working in emulation of one another and pursuing the studies of art with supreme diligence, after no long time became very excellent. And Perino, drawing from the cartoon of Michelagnolo Buonarroti in company with other young men, both Florentines and strangers, won and held the first place among them all, insomuch that he was regarded with that expectation which was afterwards fulfilled in the beautiful works that he executed with so much excellence and art. There came to Florence at that time the Florentine painter Vaga, a master of no great excellence, who was executing commonplace works at Toscanella in the province of Rome. Having a superabundance of work, he was in need of assistance, and he desired to take back with him a companion and also a young man who might help him in design in which he was wanting and in the other matters of art. Now this painter, having seen Perino drawing in the workshop of Rodolfo together with the other young men, found him so superior to them all that he was astonished, and, what is more, he was pleased with his appearance and his ways. For Perino was a beautiful youth, most courteous, modest, and gentle, and every part of his body was in keeping with the nobility of his mind. Wherefore Vaga was so charmed with him that he asked him whether he would go with him to Rome, saying that he would not fail to assist him in his studies, and promising him such benefits and conditions as he might demand. So great was the desire that Perino had to attain to excellence in his profession that, when he heard Rome mentioned, through his eagerness to see that city, he was deeply moved. But he told him that he must speak to Andrea de Cero, who had supported him up to that time, so that he was loath to abandon him. And so Vaga, having persuaded Rodolfo, Perino's master, and Andrea, who maintained him, so contrived that in the end he took Perino with the companion to Toscanella. There Perino began to work and to assist them, and they finished not only the work that Vaga had undertaken, but also many that they undertook afterwards. But Perino complained that the promise of seeing Rome, by which he had been brought from Florence, was not being fulfilled, in consequence of the profit and advantage that Vaga was drawing from his services, and he resolved to go thither by himself, which was the reason that Vaga, leaving all his works, took him to Rome. And there, through the love that he bore to art, Perino returned to his former work of drawing, and continued at it many weeks, growing more ardent every day. But Vaga wished to return to Toscanella, and therefore made him known as one belonging to himself to many commonplace painters, and also recommended him to all the friends that he had there, to the end that they might assist and favor him in his absence, from which circumstance he was always called from that day onward Perino del Vaga. Thus, left in Rome and seeing the ancient works of sculpture and the marvelous masses of buildings reduced for the most part to ruins, Perino stood lost in admiration at the greatness of the many renowned and illustrious men who had executed those works. And so, becoming ever more and more aflame with love of art, he burned unceasingly to attain to a height not too far distant from those masters, in order to win fame and profit for himself with his works, even as had been done by those at whom he marveled as he beheld their beautiful creations. And while he contemplated their greatness and the depths of his own lowliness and poverty, reflecting that he possessed nothing save the desire to rise to their height, and that, having no one who might maintain him and provide him with the means to live, he was forced, if he wished to remain alive, to labor at work for those ordinary shops, now with one painter and now with another, after the manner of the day laborers in the fields, a mode of life which so hindered his studies, he felt infinite grief and pain in his heart at not being able to make as soon as he would have liked that proficience to which his mind, his will, and his necessities were urging him. He made the resolve, therefore, to divide his time equally, working half the week at day work, and during the other half devoting his attention to design, and to this second half he added all the feast days, together with a great part of the nights, thus stealing time from time itself, in order to become famous and to escape from the hands of others so far as it might be possible. Having carried this intention into execution, he began to draw in the chapel of Pope Julius, where the vaulting had been painted by Michelangelo Buonarroti, following both his methods and the manner of Raffaello d'Urbino, and then going on to the ancient works in marble, and also to the grotesques in the grottos under the ground, which pleased him through their novelty. He learned the methods of working in stucco, gaining his bread meanwhile by grievous labor, and enduring every hardship in order to become excellent in his profession. Nor had any long time passed before he became the best and most finished draftsman that there was among all who were drawing in Rome, for the reason that he had, perhaps, a better knowledge of muscles and of the difficult art of depicting the nude than many others who were held to be among the best masters at that time. Which was the reason that he became known not only to the men of his profession, but also to many lords and prelates, and in particular Giulio Romano and Giovanni Francesco, called Il Fattore, disciples of Raffaello d'Urbino, having praised him not a little to their master, roused in him a desire to know Perino and to see his works in drawing, which having pleased him, and together with his work, his manner, his spirit, and his ways of life, he declared that among all the young men that he had known, Perino would attain to the highest perfection in that art. Meanwhile, Raffaello d'Urbino had built the papal loggie by the command of Leo X, and the same pope ordered that Raffaello should also have them adorned with stucco, painted and gilded according as it should seem best to him. Thereupon Raffaello placed at the head of that enterprise for the stucco work and the grotesques Giovanni da Udine, who was very excellent and without an equal in such works, but mostly in executing animals, fruits, and other little things. And since he had chosen in Rome and summoned from other parts a great number of masters, he had assembled together a company of men, each very able at his own work, one in stucco, another in grotesques, a third in foliage, a fourth in festoons, another in scenes, and others in other things. And according as they improved, they were brought forward and paid higher salaries, so that by competing in that work many young men attained to great perfection, who were afterwards held to be excellent in their various fields of art. Among that company, Perino was assigned to Giovanni da Udine by Raffaello, to the end that he might execute grotesques and scenes together with the others, and he was told that according as he should acquit himself, so he would be employed by Giovanni. And thus, laboring out of emulation and in order to prove his powers and make proficience, before many months had passed, Perino was held to be the first among all those who were working there, both in drawing and in coloring. The best, I say, the most perfect in grace and finish, and he who could execute both figures and grotesques in the most delicate and beautiful manner, to which clear testimony and witness are borne by the grotesques, festoons, and scenes by his hand that are in that work, which, besides surpassing the others, are executed in much more faithful accord with the designs and sketches that Raffaello made for them. This may be seen from a part of those scenes in the center of the loggia on the vaulting, where the Hebrews are depicted crossing over the Jordan with the sacred ark, and also marching round the walls of Jericho, which fall into ruin, and the other scenes that follow, such as that of Joshua causing the sun to stand still during the combat with the Amorites. Among those painted in imitation of bronze on the base, the best are likewise those by the hand of Perino, namely, Abraham sacrificing his son, Jacob wrestling with the angel, Joseph receiving his 12 brethren, the fire descending from heaven and consuming the sons of Levi, and many others, which there is no need to name, for their number is very great, and they can be distinguished from the rest. At the beginning of the loggia also, where one enters, he painted scenes from the New Testament, the Nativity and the Baptism of Christ, and his Last Supper with the Apostles, which are very beautiful. Besides which, below the windows, as has been said, are the best scenes painted in the color of bronze that there are in the whole work. These labors cause every man to marvel, both the paintings and the many works in stucco that he executed there with his own hand, and his coloring, moreover, is much more pleasing and more highly finished than that of any of the others. This work was the reason that he became famous beyond all belief. Yet this great praise did not send him to sleep, but rather, since genius grows with praise, inspired him with even more zeal, and made him almost certain that by persisting he would come to win those fruits and honors that he saw every day in the possession of Raffaello d'Urbino and Michelangelo Buonarroti, and he labored all the more willingly because he saw that he was held in estimation by Giovanni da Udine and by Raffaello, and was employed in works of importance. He always showed extraordinary deference and obedience towards Raffaello, honoring him in such a manner that he was beloved by Raffaello as a son. There was executed at this time, by order of Pope Leo, the vaulting of the Hall of the Pontiffs, which is that through which one passes by way of the loggie into the apartments of Pope Alexander VI, formerly painted by Pinturicchio, and that vaulting was painted by Giovanni Dodine and Perino. They executed in company the stucco work in all those ornaments, grotesques, and animals that are to be seen there, in addition to the varied and beautiful inventions that were depicted by them in the compartments of the ceiling, which they had divided into certain circles and ovals to contain the 7 planets of heaven, drawn by their appropriate animals, such as Jupiter drawn by eagles, Venus by doves, the moon by women, Mars by wolves, Mercury by cocks, the sun by horses, and Saturn by serpents, besides the 12 signs of the zodiac, and some figures from the 48 constellations of heaven, such as the Great Bear, the Dog Star, and many others, which, by reason of their number, we must pass over in silence, without recounting them all in their order, since anyone may see the work, which figures are almost all by the hand of Perino. In the center of the vaulting is a circle with 4 figures representing victories, seen foreshortened from below upwards, who are holding the Pope's crown and the keys. And these are very well conceived and wrought with masterly art, to say nothing of the delicacy with which he painted their vestments, veiling the nude with certain light draperies that partly reveal the naked legs and arms, a truly graceful and beautiful effect. This work was justly held, as it still is at the present day, to be very magnificent and rich in craftsmanship, and also cheerful and pleasing, worthy, in short, of that pontiff, who did not fail to reward their labors, which truly deserved some signal remuneration. Perino decorated a façade in chiaroscuro, a method brought into use at that time by the example of Polidoro and Maturino, which is opposite to the house of the Marchiones of Massa, near Maestro Pasquino, executing it with great boldness of design and with supreme diligence. In the 3rd year of his pontificate, Pope Leo paid a visit to Florence, for which many triumphal preparations were made in that city, and Perino went thither before the court, partly in order to see the pomps of the city, and partly from a wish to revisit his native country. And on a triumphal arch at San Trinita he made a large and very beautiful figure, 7 braccia high, while another was executed in competition with him by Toto da Nunziata, who had already been his rival in boyhood. But to Perino every hour seemed 1,000 years until he could return to Rome, for he perceived that the rules and methods of the Florentine craftsmen were very different from those that were customary in Rome. Wherefore he departed from Florence and returned to Rome, where he resumed his usual course of work. And in Sant Eustachio dalla Dogana he painted a St. Peter in fresco, which is a figure that has very strong relief, executed with a simple flow of folds, and yet wrought with much design and judgment. There was in Rome at this time the Archbishop of Cyprus, a man who was a great lover of the arts, and particularly of painting, and he, having a house near the Chiavica, where he had laid out a little garden with some statues and other antiquities of truly noble beauty, and desiring to enhance their effect with some fine decorations, sent for Perino, who was very much his friend, and they came to the decision that he should paint round the walls of that garden many stories of the bacchantes, satyrs, fauns, and other wild things in reference to an ancient statue of Bacchus seated beside a tiger, which the archbishop had there, and so Perino adorned that place with a variety of poetical fancies, and, among things, he painted there a little loggia with small figures, various grotesques, and many landscapes, colored with supreme grace and diligence. This work has been held by craftsmen, as it always will be, to be worthy of the highest praise, and it was the reason that he became known to the Fugger family, merchants of Germany, who, having built a house near the Banchi on the way to the church of the Florentines, and having seen Perino's work and liked it, caused him to paint there a courtyard and a loggia with many figures, all worthy of the same praise as the other works by his hand, for in them may be seen much delicacy and grace and great beauty of manner. At the same time, M. Marchione Baldassini, having caused a house to be built for him near San Agostino, as has been related by Antonio da Sangallo, who designed it very well, desired that a hall which Antonio had constructed there should be painted all over. And after passing in review many of the young painters, to the end that it might be well and beautifully done, he finally resolved to give it to Perino. Having agreed about the price, Perino set his hand to it, nor did he turn his attention from that work to any other until he had brought it to a very happy conclusion in fresco. In that hall he had made compartments by means of pilasters, which have between them niches great and small, In the larger niches are various figures of philosophers, 2 in each niche, and in some 1 only, and in the smaller niches are little boys, partly naked and partly draped in veiling, while above those small niches are some heads of women, painted in imitation of marble. Above the cornice that crowns the pilasters there follows a second series of pictures, separated from the first series below, with scenes and figures of no great size from the history of the Romans, beginning with Romulus and ending with Numa Pompilius. There are, likewise, various ornaments in imitation of different kinds of marble, and over the beautiful chimney-piece of stone is a figure of peace, burning arms and trophies, which is very lifelike. This work was held in much estimation during the lifetime of M. Marchionne, as it has been ever since by all those who work in painting, and also by many others not of the profession, who give it extraordinary praise. In the convent of the nuns of Santa Anna, Perino painted a chapel in fresco with many figures, which was executed by him with his usual diligence. And on the altar in Santo Stefano del Cacco he painted in fresco, for a Roman lady, a Pieta with the dead Christ in the lap of Our Lady, with a portrait from life of that lady, which still has the appearance of a living figure. And the whole work is very beautiful and executed with great mastery and facility. And he, setting his hand to the work, painted there a Christ in the act of crowning the Madonna. And in the background he made a Glory, with a choir of seraphim and angels clothed in light and delicate draperies, who are scattering flowers, and other children of great beauty and variety. And on the sides of the tabernacle he painted saints, San Sebastian on one side and Santo Anthony on the other. This work was executed truly well, and was equal to the others by his hand, which were always full of grace and charm. A certain protonotary had erected a chapel of marble on 4 columns in the Minerva, and desiring to leave an altarpiece there in memory of himself, even if it were but a small one, he came to an agreement with Perino, whose fame he had heard, and commissioned him to paint it in oils. And he chose that the subject should be the deposition of Christ from the cross, which Perino set himself to execute with the greatest possible zeal and diligence. In this picture he represented him as already laid upon the ground, surrounded by the Maries weeping over him, in whose gestures and attitudes he portrayed a melting pity and sorrow. Besides which there are Nicodemuses and other figures that are much admired, all woeful and afflicted at seeing the sinless Christ lying dead. But the figures that he painted most divinely were those of the 2 thieves, left fixed upon the crosses, which, besides appearing to be real dead bodies, reveal a very good mastery over muscles and nerves, which this occasion enabled him to display. Wherefore, to the eyes of him who beholds them, their limbs present themselves all drawn in that violent death by the nerves, and the muscles by the nails and cords. There is in addition a landscape wrapped in darkness, counterfeited with much judgment and art, and if the inundation which came upon Rome after the sack had not done damage to this work, covering more than half of it, its excellence would be clearly seen. But the water so softened the gesso, and caused the wood to swell in such sort, that all the lower part that was soaked has peeled off too much for the picture to give any pleasure. Nay, it is a grief and a truly heart-rending sorrow to behold it, for it would certainly have been one of the most precious things in all Rome. There was being rebuilt at this time, under the direction of Jacopo Sansovino, the church of San Marcello in Rome, a convent of Servite friars, which still remains unfinished. And when they had carried the walls of some chapels to completion, and had roofed them, those friars commissioned Perino to paint in one of these, as ornaments for a Madonna that is worshipped in that church, 2 figures in separate niches, San Joseph and San Filippo, a Servite friar and the founder of that order, one on either side of the Madonna. These finished, he painted above them some little boys that are perfect, and in the center of the wall he placed another standing upon a dado, which has upon his shoulders the ends of 2 festoons, which he directs towards the corners of the chapel, where there are 2 other little boys who support them, being seated upon them with their legs in most beautiful attitudes. All this he executed with such art, such grace, and so beautiful a manner, and gave to the flesh a tint of color so fresh and so soft, that one might say that it was real flesh rather than painted. And certainly these figures may be held to be the most beautiful that ever any craftsman painted in fresco, for the reason that there is life in their eyes and movement in their attitudes, and with the mouth they make as if to break into speech and say that art has conquered nature, and that even art declares that nothing more than this can be done in her. This work was so excellent in the sight of all good judges of art that he acquired a great name thereby. although he had executed many works and what was known of his great genius in his profession was well known, and he was therefore held in much more account and greater estimation than ever before. For this reason, Lorenzo Pucci, Cardinal Santiquattro, who had taken over a chapel on the left hand beside the principal chapel in the Trinità, a convent of Calabrian and French friars, who were the habit of San Francis of Paola, allotted it to Perino, to the end that he might paint there in fresco the life of Our Lady. Which having begun, Perino finished all the vaulting and a wall under an arch, and on the outer side also, over an arch of the chapel, he painted 2 prophets, 4 brachia and a half in height, representing Isaiah and Daniel, who in their great proportions reveal all the art, excellence of design, and beauty of coloring that can be seen in their perfection only in a picture executed by a great craftsman. This will be clearly evident to one who shall consider the Isaiah, in whom, as he reads, may be perceived the thoughtfulness that study infuses in him, and his eagerness in reading new things, for he has his gaze fixed upon a book, with one hand to his head, exactly as a man often is when he is studying. And Daniel, likewise, is motionless, with his head upraised in celestial contemplation, in order to resolve the doubts of his people. Between these figures are 2 little boys who are upholding the escutcheon of the cardinal, a shield of beautiful shape. And these boys, besides being so painted as to seem to be of flesh, also have the appearance of being in relief. The vaulting is divided into 4 scenes, separated one from another by the cross, that is, by the ribs of the vaulting. In the first is the conception of Our Lady. In the second, her nativity. In the third, the scene when she ascends the steps of the temple. And in the fourth, San Joseph marrying her. On a wall space equal in extent to the arch of the vaulting is her Visitation, in which are many figures that are very beautiful, but above all, some who have climbed on certain socles and are standing in very spirited and natural attitudes, the better to see the ceremonious meeting of those women. Besides which, there is something of the good and of the beautiful in the buildings and in every gesture of other figures. He pursued this work no further, illness coming upon him, and when he was well, there began the plague of the year 1523, which raged so violently in Rome that, if he wished to save his life, it became expedient for him to make up his mind to depart. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Yvonne Theodor. Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. By Giorgio Vasari, translated by Gaston de VERE, Section 18. Life of Perino del Vaga, Painter of Florence, Part 2. There was in the city of Rome at that time the goldsmith Piloto, who was much the friend and intimate companion of Perino, and he was desirous of departing. And so one morning, as they were breakfasting together, he persuaded Perino to take himself off and go to Florence, on the ground that it was many years since he had been there, and it could not but bring him great honor to make himself known there, and to leave some example of his excellence in that city, saying also that, although Andrea de Seri and his wife, who had brought him up, were dead, nevertheless, as a native of that country, if he had no possessions there, he had his love for it. Wherefore, after no long time, one morning Perino and Piloto departed, and set out on the way to Florence. And when they arrived there, Perino took the greatest pleasure in seeing once again the old works, painted by the masters of the past, which had been as a school to him in the days of his boyhood, and likewise those of the masters then living, who were the most celebrated and held to be the best in that city, in which, through the interest of friends, a work was allotted to him, as will be related below. It happened one day that many craftsmen, having assembled in his presence to do him honor, painters, sculptors, architects, goldsmiths, and carvers in wood and marble, who had gathered together according to the ancient custom, some to see Perino, to keep him company, and to hear what he had to say, many to learn what difference in practice there might be between the craftsmen of Rome and those of Florence, but most of them to hear the praise and censure that craftsmen are wont often to give to one another. It happened, I say, that thus discoursing together of one thing and another, and examining the works, both ancient and modern, in the various churches, they came to that of the Carmine, in order to see the chapel of Masaccio. There everyone gazed attentively at the paintings, and many various opinions were uttered in praise of that master, all declaring that they marveled that he should have possessed so much judgment as to be able in those days, without seeing anything but the work of Giotto, to work with so much of the modern manner in the design, in the coloring, and in the imitation of nature, and that he should have solved the difficulties of his art in a manner so facile. Not to mention that among all those who had worked at painting, there had not as yet been one who had equaled him in strength of relief, in resoluteness, and in mastery of execution. This kind of discourse much pleased Perino, and to all those craftsmen who spoke, thus he answered in these words: I do not deny that what you say, and even more, may be true, but that there is no one among us who can equal this manner. That I will deny with my last breath. Nay, I will declare, if I may say it with the permission of the company, not in contempt, but from a desire for the truth. For that I know many both more resolute and richer in grace, whose works are no less lifelike in the painting than these, and even much more beautiful. And I, by your leave, I who am not the first in this art, am grieved that there is no space near these works wherein I might be able to paint a figure. For before departing from Florence, I would make a trial beside one of these figures, likewise in fresco, to the end that you might see by comparison whether there be not among the moderns one who has equaled him. Among their number was a master who was held to be the first painter in Florence, and he, being curious to see the work of Perino, and perhaps wishing to lower his pride, put forward an idea of his own, which was this: Although, said he, all the space here is full, yet, since you have such a fancy, which is certainly a good one, and worthy of praise, there, on the opposite side, where there is the St. Paul by his hand, a figure no less good and beautiful than any other in the chapel, is a space in which you may easily prove what you say by making another apostle, either beside that St. Peter by Masolino, or beside the St. Paul of Masaccio, whichever you may prefer. The St. Peter was nearer the window, and the space beside it was greater and the light better, besides which it was a figure no less beautiful than the St. Paul. Everyone therefore urged Perino to do it, because they had a great desire to see that Roman manner, besides which many said that he would be the means of taking out of their heads the fancy that they had nursed in their minds for so many decades, and that if his figure should prove to be the best, all would run after modern works. Wherefore, persuaded by that master who told him at last that he ought not to disappoint the entreaties and expectations of so many lofty intellects, particularly since it would not take longer than 2 weeks to execute a figure in fresco, and they would not fail to spend years in praising his labors, Perino resolved to do it, although he who spoke thus had an intention quite contrary to his words. Being persuaded that Perino would by no means execute anything much better than the work of those craftsmen who were considered to be the most excellent at that time, Perino then undertook to make this attempt, and having summoned by common consent Messer Giovanni de Pisa, the prior of the convent, they asked him for the space for the execution of the work, which he granted to them with truly gracious courtesy, and thus they took measurements of the space with the height and breadth, and went away. An apostle was then drawn by Perino in a cartoon, in the person of St. Andrew, and finished with the greatest diligence. Whereupon Perino, having first caused the staging to be erected, was prepared to begin to paint it. But before this, on his arrival in Florence, his many friends, who had seen most excellent works by his hand in Rome, had contrived to obtain for him the commission for that work in fresco which I mentioned, to the end that he might leave some example of his handiwork in Florence, which might demonstrate how spirited and how beautiful was his genius for painting, and also to the end that he might become known and perchance be set to work on some labor of importance by those who were then governing. There were at that time certain craftsmen who used to assemble in a company called the Company of the Martyrs in the Camaldi at Florence, and they had proposed many times to have a wall that was in that place painted with the story of the martyrs being condemned to death before 2 Roman emperors, who, after they had been taken in battle, caused them to be crucified in the wood and hanged on trees. This story was suggested to Perino, and although the place was out of the way, and the price small, so much was he attracted by the possibilities of invention in the story and by the size of the wall, that he was disposed to undertake it. Besides which, he was urged not a little by those who were his friends, on the ground that the work would establish him in that reputation which his talent deserved among the citizens, who did not know him, and among his fellow craftsmen in Florence, where he was not known, save by report. Having then determined to do the work, he accepted the undertaking and made a small design, which was held to be a thing divine. And having set his hand to making a cartoon as large as the whole work, he never left off laboring at it, and carried it so far that all the principal figures were completely finished. And so the apostle was abandoned without anything more being done. Perino drew this cartoon on white paper, well shaded and hatched, leaving the paper itself for the lights, and executing the whole with admirable diligence. In it were the 2 emperors on the seat of judgment, condemning to the cross all the prisoners who were turned towards the tribunal, some kneeling, some standing, and others bowed, but all naked and bound in different ways, and writhing with piteous gestures in various attitudes, revealing the trembling of the limbs at the prospect of the severing of the soul from the body in the agony and torment of crucifixion. Besides which, there were depicted in those heads the constancy of faith in the old and the fear of death in the young, and in others the torture that they suffer from the strain of the cords on their bodies and arms. And there could also be seen the swelling of the muscles, even the cold sweat of death, all depicted in that design. Then in the soldiers who were leading them, there was revealed a terrible fury, almost impious and cruel, as they presented them at the tribunal for condemnation and led them to the cross. The emperors and the soldiers were wearing cuirasses, after the ancient manner, in garments, very ornate and bizarre, with buskins, shoes, helmets, shields, and other pieces of armor wrought with all that wealth of the most beautiful ornamentation to which a craftsman can attain in imitating and reproducing the antique, and drawn with the greatest lovingness, subtlety, and delicacy that the perfection of art can display. When this cartoon was seen by the craftsmen and by other judges of discernment, they declared that they had never seen such beauty and excellence in design, since the cartoon drawn by Michelangelo Buonarroti in Florence for the council chamber, wherefore Perino acquired the greatest fame that he could have gained in art. And while he was engaged in finishing that cartoon, he amused himself by causing oil colors to be prepared and ground in order to paint for his dearest friend, the goldsmith Pelotto, a little picture of no great size, containing a Madonna, which he carried something more than halfway towards completion. For many years past, Perino had been intimately acquainted with a certain lame priest, Ser Raffaello di Sandro, a chaplain of St. Lorenzo, who always bore love to the craftsmen of design. This priest then persuaded Perino to take up his quarters with him, seeing that he had no one to cook for him or to keep house for him, and that during the time that he had been in Florence, he had stayed now with one friend and now with another, wherefore Perino went to lodge with him, and stayed there many weeks. Meanwhile, the plague began to appear in certain parts of Florence, and filled Perino with fear, lest he should catch the infection, on which account he determined to go away, but wished first to recompense Ser Raffaello for all the days that he had eaten at his table. But Ser Raffaello would never consent to take anything, only saying, "I would be fully paid by having a scrap of paper from your hand." Seeing him to be determined, Perino took about 4 braccia of coarse canvas, and after having it fixed to the wall between 2 doors in the priest's little room, painted on it in a day and a night a scene colored in imitation of bronze. On this canvas, which was to serve as a screen for the wall, he painted the story of Moses passing the Red Sea and Pharaoh being submerged with his horses and his chariots. Perino painted therein figures in most beautiful attitudes, some swimming in armor and some naked, others swimming while clasping the horses around the neck with their beards and hair all soaked, crying out in the fear of death and struggling with all their power to escape. On the other side of the sea are Moses, Aaron, and all the other Hebrews, male and female, who are thanking God, and a number of vases that he counterfeited, carried off by them from Egypt, varied and beautiful in form and shape, and women with headdresses of great variety, which finished he left it as a mark of lovingness to Ser Raffaello, to whom it was as dear as the priorate of St. Lorenzo would have been. This canvas was afterwards much extolled and held in estimation, and after the death of Ser Raffaello, it passed, together with his other possessions, to his brother Domenico di Sandro, the cheesemonger. Departing then from Florence, Perino abandoned the work of the martyrs, which caused him great regret, and certainly, if it had been in any other place but the Camaldi, he would have finished it. But considering that the officials of health had taken that very convent of Camaldi for those infected with the plague, he thought it better to save himself than to leave fame behind him in Florence, being satisfied that he had proved how much he was worth in the design. The cartoon, with his other things, remained in the possession of the goldsmith Giovanni di Giorgio, his friend, who died in the plague, and after that it fell into the hands of Pilotto, who kept it spread out in his house for many years, showing it readily as a very rare work to every person of intelligence. But I do not know what became of it after the death of Pilotto. Perino stayed for many months in various places, seeking to avoid the plague. But for all this, he never spent his time in vain, for he was continually drawing and studying the secrets of art. And when the plague had ceased, he returned to Rome and gave his attention to executing little works, of which I shall say nothing more. In the year 1523 came the election of Pope Clement VII, which was the greatest of blessings for the arts of painting and sculpture, which had been so kept down by Adrian VI during his lifetime, that not only had nothing been executed for him, but, as had been related in other places, not delighting in them, or rather holding them in detestation. He had brought it about that no other person delighted in them, or spent money upon them, or employed a single craftsman. Then, therefore, after the election of the new pontiff, Perino executed many works. Afterwards it was proposed that Giulio Romano and Giovanni Francesco, called Il Fattore, should be made heads of the world of art in place of Raffaello, who was dead, to the end that they might distribute the various works to the others, according to the previous custom. But Perino, in executing an escutcheon of the Pope in fresco over the door of Cardinal Cicerino, after the cartoon of Giulio Romano, acquitted himself so excellently well that they doubted whether he would not be preferred to themselves, because although they were known as the disciples of Raffaello and as the heirs to his possessions, they had not inherited the whole of the art and grace that he used to give to his figures with colors. Giulio and Giovanni Francesco, therefore, made up their minds to attach Perino to themselves, and so, in the holy year of Jubilee, 1525, they gave him Caterina, the sister of Giovanni Francesco, for wife, to the end that the perfect friendship which had been maintained between them for so long might be converted into kinship. Thereupon, continuing the works that he had in hand, no long time had passed when, on account of the praises bestowed upon him for the first works executed by him in St. Marcello, it was resolved by the prior of that convent and by certain heads of the Company of the Crocifisso, which has a chapel there built by its members as a place of assembly, that the chapel should be painted, and so they allotted this work to Perino, in the hope of having some excellent painting by his hand. Perino, having caused the staging to be erected, began his work, and in the center of the barrel-shaped vaulting he painted the scene when God, after creating Adam, takes his wife Eve from his side. In this scene Adam, a most beautiful naked figure, painted with perfect art, is seen lying overcome by sleep. while Eve, with great vivacity, rises to her feet with the hands clasped, and receives the benediction of her Maker, the figure of whom is depicted in grave aspect and sublime in majesty, standing with many draperies about him, which curve around his nude form with their borders. On one side, on the right hand, are two evangelists, St. Mark and St. John, the first of whom Perino finished entirely, and also the second with the exception of the head and a naked arm. Between these two evangelists, by the way of ornament, he made two little boys embracing a candelabrum, which are truly of living flesh, and the evangelists, likewise in the heads, the draperies, the arms, and all that he painted in them with his own hand, are very beautiful. While he was executing this work, he suffered many interruptions from illness and from other misfortunes, such as happen every day to all who live in this world. Besides which, it is said that the men of the company also ran short of money. And so long did this business drag on, that in the year 1527 there came upon them the ruin of Rome, when that city was given over to sack. Many craftsmen were killed, and many works destroyed or carried away. Whereupon Perino, caught in that turmoil, and having a wife and a baby girl, ran from place to place in Rome with the child in his arms, seeking to save her, and finally, poor wretch, was taken prisoner and reduced to paying a ransom, which hit him so hard that he was like to go out of his mind. When the fury of the sack had abated, he was so crushed down by the fear that still possessed him, that all thought of art was worlds away from him. But nevertheless he painted canvases in gouache and other fantasies for certain Spanish soldiers, and after regaining his composure he lived like the rest in some poor fashion, alone among so many. But VERE, who had the engravings of Raphael, had not lost much. Wherefore, moved by the friendship that he had with Perino, and wishing to employ him, he commissioned him to draw some of the stories of the gods, transforming themselves in order to achieve the consummation of their loves. These were engraved on copper by Jacopo Caraglio, an excellent engraver of prints, who acquitted himself so well in the matter of these designs, that preserving the outlines and manner of Perino, and hatching the work with beautiful facility, he sought also to impart in the gravings that grace and that delicacy which Perino had given to the drawings. While the havoc of the sack had destroyed Rome, and driven away the inhabitants, and the Pope himself, who was living at Orvieto, not many remaining in the city, and no business of any kind being done there arrived in Rome one Niccolò Veneziano, a rare and even unrivaled master of embroidery, the servant of Prince Doria. He, moved by his long-standing friendship with Perino, and being a man who always favored and wished well to the men of our arts, persuaded him to leave that misery and set out for Genoa, promising that he would so go to work for that prince, who was a lover of art and delighted in painting, that he would commission Perino to execute some big works, and saying moreover that his Excellency had often told him that he would like to have a suite of rooms adorned with handsome decorations. It did not take much to persuade Perino, for he was oppressed by want and burning with desire to leave Rome, and he determined to depart with Niccolò. Having therefore made arrangements for leaving his wife and daughter well cared for by relatives in Rome, and having put all his affairs in order, he set off for Genoa. Arriving there and making himself known to that prince by means of Niccolò, his coming was as welcome to his Excellency as any agreeable experience that he had ever had in all his life. He was received therefore with the greatest possible warmth and gladness, and after many conversations and discussions, they finally arranged that he should begin the work, and they decided that he should execute a palace adorned with stucco work and with pictures in fresco, in oils, and of every kind, which I will strive to describe as briefly as I am able, with all the rooms, pictures, and general arrangement, saying nothing as to where Perino first began to labor, to the end that I may not obscure his work, which is the best of all those by his hand, with words. I begin then by saying that at the entrance of the prince's palace there is a marble portal composed in the Doric order, and built after designs and models by the hand of Perino, with all its appurtenances of pedestals, sockles, shafts, capitals, architrave, frieze, cornice, and pediment, with some of the most beautiful seated figures of women, who are supporting an escutcheon. The masonry and carving of this work were executed by Maestro Giovanni de Fisio, and the figures were finished to perfection by Silvio, the sculptor of Fisio, a bold and resolute master. Entering within the portal, one finds over the vestibule a vault covered with stucco work, varied scenes and grotesques, and little arches in each of which are scenes of war and various kinds of battles, some fighting on foot and others on horseback, and all wrought with truly extraordinary diligence and art. On the left one finds the staircase, which has decorations of little grotesques after the antique that could not be richer or more beautiful, with various scenes and little figures, masks, children, animals, and other things of fancy, executed with that invention and judgment that always marked his work, insomuch that of their kind they may well be called divine. Having ascended the staircase, one comes into a most beautiful loggia, which has at each end a very handsome door of stone, and over each of these doors, in the pediment, are painted two figures, one male and the other female, represented in directly opposite attitudes, one showing the front view and the other the back. The vaulting has 5 arches and is wrought superbly in stucco, and it is also divided by pictures in certain ovals, containing scenes executed with the most perfect beauty that could be achieved, and the walls are painted down to the floor with many seated figures of captains in armor, some drawn from life and some from imagination, and representing all the ancient and modern captains of the house of Doria. And above them are large letters of gold, which run thus: Magni viri maximi ducis, optima facere pro patria. In the first hall, which opens into the loggia, and is entered by one of the 2 doors, that on the left hand, there are most beautiful ornaments of stucco on the corners of the vaulting, and in the center there is a large scene of the shipwreck of Aeneas in the sea, in which are nude figures, living and dead, in attitudes of infinite variety, besides a good number of ships and galleys, some sound and some shattered by the fury of the tempest, not without beautiful considerations in the figures of the living, who are striving to save themselves, and expressions of terror that are produced in their features by the struggle with the waves, the danger of death, and all the emotions aroused by the perils of the sea. This was the first scene and the first work that Perino began for the prince. It is said that when he arrived in Genoa, Girolamo da Treviso had already appeared there in advance of him in order to execute certain pictures, and was painting a wall that faced towards the garden, and after Perino had begun to draw the cartoon for the scene of the shipwreck that has been described above, while he was taking his time about it, amusing himself in seeing Genoa, and laboring only at intervals at the cartoon. Although a great part was finished in various ways, and those nudes were drawn, some in chiaroscuro, some in charcoal, and others in black chalk, some being drawn in imitation of gradine work, others shaded, and others again only outlined. While I say Perino was going on in this way, without beginning to paint, Girolamo da Treviso murmured against him, saying, "Cartoons, and nothing but cartoons. I have my art at the tip of my brush," decrying him very often in this or some other similar manner. It came to the ears of Perino, who took offense, straightway caused his cartoon to be fixed to the vaulting where the scene was to be painted, and the boards of his staging to be removed in many places, to the end that the work might be seen from below, and then he threw open the hall. Which hearing, all Genoa ran to see it, and amazed by Perino's grand design, they praised him to the skies. Thither, among others, went Girolamo da Treviso, who saw what he had never thought to see from the hand of Perino, whereupon, dumbfounded by the beauty of the work, he departed from Genoa without asking leave of Prince Doria, and returned to Bologna, where he lived. Perino was thus left alone in the service of the prince, and finished that hall, painting it in oils on the surface of the walls, and it was held to be, as indeed it is, a thing unrivaled in its beauty, with this lovely work in stucco in the center of the vaulting, and all around, even below the lunettes, as I have described. In the other hall, into which one enters by the right-hand door in the loggia, he executed on the vaulting works in stucco, almost similar in design to those of the other, and painted pictures in fresco of Jove slaying the giants with his thunderbolts, in which are many very beautiful nudes, larger than life. In the heaven, likewise, are all the gods, who are making gestures of great vivacity and truly appropriate to their natures, amid the terrible uproar of the thunder. Besides which, The stucco work is executed with supreme diligence, and the fresco coloring could not be more beautiful. Seeing that Perino was very able, indeed a perfect master, in that field, near this he adorned 4 chambers, the ceilings of which are all wrought in stucco, and distributed among them, in fresco, are the most beautiful fables from Ovid, which have all the appearance of reality. Nor could anyone imagine the beauty, the abundance, the variety, and the great numbers of the little figures, animals, foliage, and grotesques that are in them, all executed with lively invention. Beside the other hall, likewise, he adorned 4 more chambers, but only directing the work, which was carried out by his assistants, although he gave them the designs both of the stucco decorations and of the scenes, figures, and grotesques, upon which a vast number of them worked, some little and some much, such as Lucio Romano, who did much work in stucco there, and many grotesques and a number of Lombards. Let it suffice to say that there is no room there that is not something by his hand and is not full of ornaments, even to the space below the vaulting, with various compositions, full of children, bizarre masks, and animals, which all defies description, not to mention that the little studies, the antechambers, the closets, and all other parts of the palace are painted and made beautiful. From the palace one passes into the garden and into a low building, which has the most ornate decorations in all the rooms, even below the ceilings, and so also the halls, chambers, and anterooms, all adorned by the same hand. In this work Pordenone also took a part, as I said, in his life, and likewise Domenico Beccafumi of Siena, a very rare painter, who showed that he was not inferior to any of the others, although the works by his hand that are in Siena are the most excellent among the vast number that he painted. But to return to the works that Perino executed, after those that he did in the palace of the prince, he executed a frieze in a room in the house of Gina Tindoria, containing most beautiful women, and he did many works for various gentlemen throughout the city, both in fresco and in oil colors. He painted a most beautiful altarpiece, very finely designed, for St. Francesco, and another for a church called St. Maria de Consolacion, at the commission of a gentleman of the house Bacedone, in which picture he painted the Nativity of Christ, a work that is much extolled. But it is placed in a position so dark that by reason of the light not being good enough, one is not able to recognize its perfection, and all the more because Perino strove to paint it in a dark manner, so that it has need of a strong light. He also has made drawings of the greater part of the Aeneid, with the stories of Dido, from which tapestries were woven, and he likewise drew beautiful ornaments for the poops of galleys, which were carved and finished to perfection by Corrado and Tasso, wood carvers of Florence, who proved excellently how able they were in that art. And in addition to all these things he also executed a vast number of works on cloth for the galleys of the prince, and the largest standards that could be made for their adornment and embellishment. Wherefore he was so loved by that prince, for his fine qualities, that if he had continued to serve him, the prince would have richly rewarded his abilities. But while he was working in Genoa, the fancy came to him to fetch his wife from Rome, and so he built a house in Pisa, being pleased with that city, and half thinking of choosing it as his place of habitation when old age should come upon him. Now at that time the warden of the Duomo at Pisa was Messer Antonio de Urbano, who had a very great desire to embellish that temple, and had already caused a beginning to be made with some very beautiful ornaments of marble for the chapels of the church, which had been executed by the hand of Stagio da Pietrasanta, a very able and well-practiced carver of marble, removing some old clumsy and badly proportioned chapels that were there. Having thus made a beginning, the warden proposed to fill up those ornaments in the interior with altarpieces and oils, and on the outer side with a series of scenes in fresco and decorations in stucco by the hands of the best and most excellent masters that he could find, without grudging any expense that might be incurred. He had already set to work on the sacristy, which he had placed in the great recess behind the high altar, and there the ornamentation of marble was already finished, and many pictures had been painted by the Florentine painter Giovanni Antonio Sogliani, the rest of which, together with the altarpieces and the chapels that were wanting, were finished many years afterwards by the order of Messer Sebastiano della Seta, the warden of the Duomo in those days. End of section 18. Recording by Yvonne Theodor.
Section 19 of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Theoden Humphrey. Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6 by Giorgio Vasari. Translated by Gaston de VERE. Section 19. Life of Perino del Vaga, Painter of Florence, Part 3. At that time, Perino returned from Genoa to Pisa, and having seen that beginning, at the instance of Battista del Cervelliera, a person well conversant with art and a most ingenious master of wood-carving, perspective, and inlaying, he was presented to the warden. After they had discoursed together on the subject of the works of the Duomo, Perino was asked to paint an altarpiece for an ornament immediately within the ordinary door of entrance, the ornamental frame being already finished, and above that a scene of St. George slaying the dragon and delivering the king's daughter. Perino therefore made a most beautiful design, which included a row of children and other ornaments in fresco between one chapel and the other, and niches with prophets and scenes of various kinds. And this design pleased the warden. And so, having made the cartoon for one of them, the first one, that opposite to the door mentioned above, he began to execute it in color, and finished 6 children, which are very well painted. He was to have continued this right round, which would have made a very rich and very beautiful decoration, and the whole work together would have proved to be something very handsome. But he was seized with a desire to return to Genoa, where he had involved himself in love affairs and other pleasures, to which he was inclined at certain times. And on his departure he gave to the nuns of Santa Maffeo a little altarpiece that he had painted for them in oils, which is now in their possession in the convent. Then, having arrived in Genoa, he stayed there many months, executing other works for the prince. His departure from Pisa displeased the warden greatly, and even more the circumstance that the work remained unfinished. Wherefore he did not cease to write to him every day that he should return, or to make inquiries from Perino's wife, whom he had left in Pisa. But finally, perceiving that the matter would never end, Perino neither answering nor returning, he allotted the altarpiece of that chapel to Giovanni Antonio Sogliani, who finished it and set it into its place. Not long after this, Perino returned to Pisa, and seeing the work of Sogliani, flew into a rage, and would on no account continue what he had begun, saying that he did not choose that his pictures should serve as ornaments for those of other masters. Wherefore, so far as concerned him, that work remained unfinished. Giovanni Antonio carried it on to such purpose that he painted 4 altarpieces, but these, at a later date, appeared to Sebastiano della Seta, the new warden, to be all in the same manner, and somewhat less beautiful than the first, and he allotted to Domenico Beccafumi of Siena, after proving his worth from some pictures that he painted round the sacristy, which are very beautiful, an altarpiece which he executed in Pisa. This not giving as much satisfaction as the first pictures, he caused the 2 last that were wanting to be painted by Giorgio Vasari of Arezzo, and they were placed at the 2 doors beside the corner walls of the main facade of the church. Of these, as well as of many other works, both large and small, that are dispersed throughout Italy and various places abroad, it does not become me to say more, and I will leave the right of free judgment about them to all who have seen or may see them. The loss of this work caused real vexation to Perino, he having already made the designs for it, which gave promise that it would prove to be something worthy of him, and likely to give that temple great fame over and above that of its antiquities, and also to make Perino immortal. During the many years of his sojourn in Genoa, although he drew both profit and pleasure from that city, Perino had grown weary of it, as he remembered Rome in the happy days of Leo. But although, during the lifetime of Cardinal Ippolito de' Medici, he had received letters inviting him into his service, and he had been disposed to enter it, the death of that lord brought it about that he hesitated to repatriate himself. While matters stood thus, with his many friends urging his return, himself desiring it infinitely more than any of them, and several letters being exchanged, one morning, in the end, the fancy took him, and without saying a word, he set off from Pisa and made his way to Rome. There, after making himself known to the most reverend Cardinal Farnese, and then to Pope Paul, he stayed many months without doing anything. First, because he was put off from one day to another, and then because he was attacked by some infirmity in one of his arms, on account of which he spent several hundreds of crowns, to say nothing of the discomfort, before he could be cured of it. Wherefore, having no one to maintain him, and being vexed by his cold welcome from the court, he was tempted many times to go away. But Moltza and many other friends exhorted him to have patience, telling him that Rome was no longer what she had been, and that now she expected that a man should be exhausted and weary of her before she would choose and cherish him as her own, and particularly if he were pursuing the path of some fine art. At this time, Maestro Pietro de Massimi bought a chapel in the Trinita, with the vaulting and the lunettes painted and adorned with stucco, and the altarpiece painted in oils, all by Giulio Romano and Perino's brother-in-law, Giovan Francesco, and that gentleman was desirous to have it finished. In the lunettes were 4 stories of Santa Mary Magdalene in fresco, and in the altarpiece in oils was Christ appearing to Mary Magdalene in the form of a gardener. And Maestro Pietro first caused a gilt frame of wood to be made for the altarpiece, which had a miserable one of stucco, and then allotted the walls to Perino, who, having caused the staging and the screen to be erected, set his hand to the work, and after many months brought it to completion. He made a design of bizarre and beautiful grotesques, partly in low relief and partly painted, and he executed 2 little scenes of no great size, one on each wall, surrounding them with an ornament in stucco of great variety. In one scene was the pool of Bethesda, with all the cripples and sick persons, and the angel who comes to move the waters, the porticos seen most beautifully foreshortened in perspective, and the movements and vestments of the priests, all painted with great grace and vivacity, although the figures are not very large. In the other he painted the raising of Lazarus after he had been dead 4 days, wherein he is seen newly restored to life, and still marked by the pallor and fear of death. And round him are many who are unswathing him, and not a few who are marveling, and others struck with awe, besides which the scene is adorned with some little temples that recede into the distance, executed with supreme lovingness, as are also the works in stucco all around. There are likewise 4 very small scenes, 2 to each wall, and 1 on either side of the larger scene, in one of which is the centurion beseeching Christ that he should heal with a word his son who is dying. In another, Christ driving the traders from the temple. In a third, the Transfiguration, and in the last, a similar scene. And on the projections of the pilasters within the chapel, he painted 4 figures in the guise of prophets, which, in their proportions, their excellence, and their beauty, are as well executed and finished as they could well be. In a word, the whole work was carried out with such diligence, and is so delicate, that it resembles miniature rather than painting. In it may be seen much charm and vivacity of coloring, and signs of great patience in its execution, revealing that true love which should be felt for art. And he painted this whole work with his own hand, although he had a great part of the stucco work executed after his designs by Guglielmo Milanese, whom he had formerly had with him at Genoa, loving him much, and once even offering to give him his daughter in marriage. This Guglielmo, in reward for restoring the antiquities of the house of Farnese, has now been made Friar of the Piombo, in the place of Fra Sebastiano Viniziano. I must not omit to tell that against one wall of this chapel was a most beautiful tomb of marble, with a dead woman of marble, beautifully carved by the sculptor Bologna on the sarcophagus, and 2 little naked boys at the sides. The countenance of that woman was a lifelike portrait of a very famous courtesan of Rome, who left that memorial of herself, which was removed by the friars because they felt scruples that such a woman should have been laid to rest there with so much honor. This work, with many designs that he made, was the reason that the very reverend Cardinal Farnese began to give him an allowance and to make use of him in many works. By order of Pope Paul, a chimney piece that was in the chamber of the burning of the Borgo was placed in that of the Segnatura, where there were the panellings with perspective views in wood executed by the hand of the carver Fra Giovanni for Pope Julius. Raffaello had painted both of those chambers, but it became necessary to repaint all the base to the scenes in the chamber of the Segnatura, which is that in which is the picture of Mount Parnassus. On which account a decorative design in imitation of marble was painted by Perino, with various terminal figures, festoons, masks, and other ornaments, and in certain spaces scenes painted to look like bronze, which are very beautiful for works in fresco. In these scenes, even as above them were philosophers discoursing on philosophy, theologians on theology, and poets on poetry, were all the actions of those who have been eminent in those professions. And although he did not execute them all with his own hand, he retouched them so much a secco, besides making perfectly finished cartoons, that they may almost be said to be entirely by his hand, which method he employed because, being troubled by a catarrh, he was not fit for so much labor. Whereupon the Pope, recognizing that he deserved something both on account of his age and for all his work, and hearing him much recommended, gave him an allowance of 25 ducats a month, which lasted up to his death, on the condition that he should have charge of the palace and of the house of the Farnese family. By this time, Michelagnolo Buonarroti had uncovered the wall with the Last Judgment in the papal chapel, and there remained still unpainted the base below, where there was to be fixed a screen of arras woven in silk and gold, like the tapestries that adorn the chapel. Wherefore, the Pope having ordained that the weaving should be done in Flanders, it was arranged that with the consent of Michelagnolo that Perino should begin to paint a canvas of the same size, which he did, executing in it women, children, and terminal figures holding festoons, and all very lifelike, with the most bizarre things of fancy. But this work, which was truly worthy of him, and of the divine picture that it was to adorn, remained unfinished after his death in some apartments of the Belvedere. After this, Antonio de San Gallo, having finished the building of the great Hall of Kings in front of the chapel of Sixtus IV in the papal palace, Perino divided the ceiling into a large pattern of octagonal compartments, crosses, and ovals, both sunk and in relief, which done, Perino was also commissioned to adorn it with stucco work, with the richest and most beautiful ornaments that could be produced by all the resources of that art. He thus began it, and in the octagons, in place of rosettes, he made 4 little boys in full relief, who, with their feet pointing to the center and their arms forming a circle, make a most beautiful rosette. And in the rest of the compartments are all the devices of the house of Farnese, with the arms of the Pope in the center of the vaulting. And this work in stucco may be said with truth to have surpassed in mastery of execution, in beauty, and in delicacy, all those that have ever been done by ancients or moderns, and to be truly worthy of the head of the Christian religion. After the designs of the same man, likewise, the glass windows were executed by Pastorino da Siena, an able master of that craft, and Perino caused the walls below to be prepared with very beautiful ornaments in stucco, intending to paint scenes there with his own hand, which were afterwards continued by the painter Daniele Ricciarelli of Volterra, who, if death had not cut short the noble aspirations that he had, would have proved how the moderns have the courage not only to equal the ancients with their works, but perhaps even to surpass them by a great measure. While the stucco work of this vaulting was in progress, and Perino was considering the designs for his scenes, the old walls of the church of San Pietro at Rome were being pulled down to make way for those of the new building, and the masons came to a wall where there was a Madonna with other pictures, by the hand of Giotto, which being seen by Perino, who was in the company of Messer Niccolò Acciaiuolo, a Florentine doctor and much his friend, both of them were moved to pity for that picture, and would not allow it to be destroyed. Nay, having caused the wall to be cut away around it, they had it well braced with beams and bars of iron, and deposited below the organ of San Pietro, in a place where there was neither altar nor any other consecrated object. And before the wall that had been round the Madonna was pulled down, Perino copied the figure of Orso della Anguillara, the Roman senator who had crowned Maestro Francesco Petrarca on the Campidoglio, and who was at the feet of that Madonna. Round the picture of the Madonna were to be made some ornaments in stucco and painting, and together with them a memorial to a certain Niccolò Acciaiuoli, who had formerly been a Roman senator, And Perino, having made the designs, straightway set his hand to the work, and assisted by his young men and by Marcello Mantovano, his disciple, carried it out with great diligence. In the same San Pietro, the sacrament did not occupy, with regard to masonry, a very honorable position. Wherefore certain deputies were appointed from the company of the sacrament, who ordained that a chapel should be built in the center of the old church by Antonio de San Gallo, partly with remains in the form of ancient marble columns, and partly with other ornaments of marble, bronze, and stucco, placing in the center a tabernacle by the hand of Donatello, by way of further adornment. And Perino executed there a very beautiful ceiling, with many minute scenes, full of figures from the Old Testament, symbolical of the sacrament. In the middle of it also he painted a somewhat larger scene, containing the Last Supper of Christ with the apostles, and below it 2 prophets, one on either side of the body of Christ. The same master likewise caused his young men to paint in the church of San Giuseppe, near the Ripetta, the chapel of that church, which was afterwards retouched and finished by himself. And he also had a chapel painted after his design in the church of San Bartolomeo in Isola, which he retouched in like manner, and caused some scenes to be painted at the high altar of San Salvatore del Lauro, with some grotesques on the vaulting, and likewise an Annunciation on the façade outside, which was executed by his pupil, Girolamo Sermonetta. Thus then, partly because he was not able, and partly because the labor wearied him, liking to design his works rather than to execute them, he pursued the same course that Raffaello da Urbino had formerly followed at the end of his life. How harmful and how blameworthy is this practice is proved by the Chigi works, and by all those carried out by other hands, and is also shown by those that Perino caused to be executed in the same way. Besides which, those works of Giulio Romano's that he did not paint with his own hand have not done him much honor. And although this method pleases princes, giving them their works quickly, and perhaps benefits the craftsmen who labor upon them, yet, if they were the ablest men in the world, they could never feel that love for the works of others which a man feels for his own. Nor, however well drawn the cartoons may be, can they be imitated as exactly and as thoroughly as by the hand of their author, who, seeing the work going to ruin, in despair leaves it to fall into complete destruction. He then who thirsts for honor should do his own painting. This I can say from experience, for after I had labored with the greatest possible pains on the cartoons for the Hall of the Cancelleria in the Palace of San Giorgio in Rome, the work having to be executed with great haste in 100 days, a vast number of painters were employed to paint it, who departed so far from their outlines and their true form that I made a resolution to which I have adhered, that from that time onward no one should lay a hand on any works of mine. Whoever therefore wishes to ensure long life for his name and his works should undertake fewer, and do them all with his own hand, if he desires to obtain that full meed of honor that a man of exalted genius seeks to acquire. I say then that Perino, by reason of the number of the labors committed to his care, was forced to employ many persons, and he thirsted rather for gain than for glory, considering that he had thrown away his life and had saved nothing in his youth. And it vexed him so much to see young men coming forward to undertake work, that he sought to enroll them all under his own command, to the end that they might not encroach on his position. Now in the year 1546 there came to Rome the Venetian Tiziano da Cadore, a painter highly celebrated for his portraits, who, having formerly taken a portrait of Pope Paul at the time when His Holiness went to Busseto, without exacting any remuneration either for that or for some others that he had executed for Cardinal Farnese and Santa Fiore, was received by those prelates with the greatest honor in the Belvedere. At which a rumor arose in the court, and then spread throughout Rome, to the effect that he had come in order to paint scenes with his own hand in the Hall of Kings in the palace, where Perino was to paint them, and the stucco work was already in progress. This arrival caused much vexation to Perino, and he complained of it to many of his friends, not because he believed that Tiziano was likely to surpass him at painting historical scenes in fresco, but because he desired to occupy himself with that work peacefully and honorably until his death. And if he was to do it, he wished to do it without competition, the wall and the vaulting by Michelagnolo in the chapel close by being more than enough for him by way of comparison. That suspicion was the reason that while Tiziano stayed in Rome, Perino always avoided him, and remained in an ill humor until his departure. The Castellan of the Castello di San Angelo, Tiberio Crispo, who was afterwards made a cardinal, being a person who delighted in our arts, made up his mind to beautify the castle, and rebuilt loggie, chambers, halls, and apartments in a very handsome manner, in order to be able to receive His Holiness more worthily when he went there. Many rooms and other ornaments were executed from the designs and under the direction of Raffaello da Montelupo, and then in the end by Antonio da San Gallo, and a loggia was wrought in stucco under the supervision of Raffaello, who also made the Angel of Marble, a figure 6 braccia high, which was placed on the summit of the highest tower in the castle. Tiberio then caused the said loggia, which is the one facing the meadows, to be painted by Girolamo Sermonetta, which, finished, the rest of the rooms were entrusted in part to Lucio Romano, and finally the halls and other important apartments were finished partly by Perino with his own hand, and partly by others after his cartoons. The principal hall is very pleasing and beautiful, being wrought in stucco and all filled with scenes from Roman history, executed for the most part by Perino's young men, and not a few by the hand of Marco da Siena, the disciple of Domenico Beccafumi, and in certain rooms there are most beautiful friezes. Perino, when he could find young men of ability, was wont to make use of them willingly in his works, but for all that he never ceased to execute any commonplace commission. He very often painted pennons for trumpets, banners for the castle, and those of the fleet of the militant order, and he executed hangings, tabards, door curtains, and the most insignificant works of art. He began some canvases from which tapestries were to be woven for Prince Doria, and he painted a chapel for the very Reverend Cardinal Farnese, and a writing study for the most illustrious Madama Margherita of Austria. He caused an ornamental frame to be made round the Madonna in Santa Maria del Pianto, and also another ornamental frame round the Madonna in Piazza Giudia, and he executed many other works, of which, by reason of their number, I will not now make any further mention, particularly because he was accustomed to accept any sort of work that came to his hand. This disposition of Perino's, which was well known to the officials of the palace, was the reason that he always had something to do for one or another of them, and he did it willingly, in order to bind them to himself, so that they might be obliged to serve him in the payment of his allowances and in his other requirements. In addition to this, Perino had acquired such authority that all the work in Rome was allotted to him, for the reason that, besides the circumstance that it appeared to be in a certain sense his due, he would sometimes execute commissions for the most paltry prices, whereby he did little good, nay rather, much harm to himself and to art. That these words are true is proved by this, that if he had undertaken to paint the Hall of Kings in the palace on his own account, and had worked at it together with his own assistance, he would have saved several hundreds of crowns, which all went to the overseers who had charge of the work, and paid the daily wages to those who worked there. Thus, having undertaken a burden so heavy and so laborious, and being infirm and enfeebled by catarrh, he was not able to endure such discomforts, having to draw day and night, and to meet the demands of the palace, and, among other things, to make the designs of embroideries, of engravings for banner makers, and of innumerable ornaments required by the caprice of Farnese and other cardinals and noblemen. In short, having his mind incessantly occupied, and being always surrounded by sculptors, masters in stucco, wood carvers, seamsters, embroiderers, painters, gilders, and other such like craftsmen, he had never an hour of repose. And the only happiness and contentment that he knew in this life were to find himself at times with some of his friends at a tavern, which was his favorite haunt in all the places where it fell to his lot to live, considering that this was the true blessedness and peace of this world, and the only repose from his labors. And thus, having ruined his constitution by the fatigues of his art and by his excesses in eating and in love, he was attacked by asthma, which, sapping his strength little by little, finally caused him to sink into consumption. And one evening, while talking with a friend near his house, he fell dead of an apoplectic seizure in his 47th year. At this many craftsmen felt infinite sorrow, it being a truly great loss that art suffered. And he received honorable burial from his son-in-law, Maestro Gioseffo Cincio, the physician of Madama, and from his wife in the chapel of San Giuseppe in the Ritonda at Rome, with the following epitaph: Perino Bonacursio Vagae Florentino, qui ingenio et arte singulari egregios cum pictores permultos, tum plastus omnes facile superavit, Catharina Perina conjugi, Lavinia Bonacursia parenti, Josephus Cincius Succero carissimo et optimo facere. Vixit an 46, men 3, dies 21. Mortuus est 14 calend Novemb an Christ 1547. The place of Perino was filled by Daniello of Volterra, who had worked much with him, and who finished the 2 other prophets that are in the chapel of the Crocifisso in San Marcello. Daniello has also adorned a chapel in Santa Trinita most beautifully with stucco work and painting, for Signora Elena Orsina, with many other works of which mention will be made in the proper place. Perino, then, as may be seen from the works described, and from many others that might be mentioned, was one of the most versatile painters of our times, in that he assisted the craftsmen to work excellently in stucco, and executed grotesques, landscapes, animals, and all the other things of which a painter can have knowledge, using colors in fresco, in oils, and in distemper. Whence it may be said that he was the father of these most noble arts, seeing that his talents live in those who are continually imitating him in every honorable field of art. After Perino's death were published many prints taken from his drawings, such as the slaying of the giants that he executed in Genoa, 8 stories of St. Peter taken from the Acts of the Apostles, of which he made designs for the embroidering of a cope for Pope Paul III, and many other things which are known by the manner. Perino made use of many young men, and taught the secrets of art to many disciples, but the best of them all, and the one of whom he availed himself more than of any other, was Girolamo Siciliante of Sermoneta, of whom there will be an account in the proper place. His disciple likewise was Marcello Mantovano, who executed on a wall at the entrance of the Castello di San Angelo, after the design and under the direction of Perino, a Madonna with many saints in fresco, which was a very beautiful thing. But of his works as well there will be an account elsewhere. Perino left many designs at his death, some by his hand and some by others. Among the latter, one of the whole chapel of Michelagnolo Buonarroti, drawn by the hand of Leonardo Cunghi of Borgo a San Sepolcro, which was an excellent work. All these designs with other things were sold by his heirs, and in our book are many drawings done by him with the pen, which are very beautiful. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Xiaoyan Arrowsmith. Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6, by Giorgio Vasari, translated by Gaston to C. de VERE. Section 20, To the Craftsmen in Design. Excellent and well-beloved brother craftsman, so great has always been the delight, to say nothing of the profit and honor, that I have derived from practicing my hand to the best of my ability in this most noble art of ours, that I have not only had a burning desire to exalt and to celebrate her and to honor her in every manner open to me, but have also been full of affection for all those who have taken the same pleasure in her and have succeeded in practicing her more happily than I, perhaps, have been able to do. And from this my goodwill, so full of most sincere affection, it appears to me that I have gathered hitherto fruits that are an ample reward, for I have been always loved and honoured by you all, and we have been united in a most perfect intimacy or brotherhood, I know not which to call it, mutually showing our works to one another, I to you and you to me, and helping one another with counsel and assistance whenever the occasion has presented itself. Wherefore I have always felt myself deeply bound by this loving fellowship, and much more by your excellent abilities, and no less also by this my inclination, by nature and by the most powerful attraction, to assist and serve you in every way and every matter wherein I have considered myself able to bring you pleasure or advantage. To this end, I published in the year 1550 the lives of our best and most famous craftsmen, moved by a cause that has been mentioned in another place, and also, to tell the truth, by a generous indignation that so much talent should have been for so long a time, and should still remain, buried in oblivion. And this my labour appears not to have been in any way unwelcome, on the contrary, so acceptable that, not to mention what has been said and written to me from many quarters, out of the vast number that were printed at that time, there is not one single volume to be found at the booksellers. Thus, therefore, receiving everyday requests from many friends, and understanding no less clearly the unexpressed desires of many others, once more, although in the midst of most important undertakings, I have applied myself to the same labour, with the intention not only of adding those masters who have passed to a better world between that time and the present, thus giving me the opportunity of writing their lives in full, but also of supplying that which may have been wanting to the perfection of my first work. For since then I have had leisure to come to a better knowledge of many matters, and to re-examine others, not only by the favour of these my most illustrious lords, whom I serve, the true refuge and protection of all the arts, but also through the facilities that they have given me to search the whole of Italy once again, and to see and understand many things which had not before come under my notice. I have been able, therefore, not merely to make corrections, but also to add so many things, that many of the lives may be said to have been almost written anew, while some, indeed, even of the old masters, which were not there before, have been added. Nor the better to revive the memory of those whom I so greatly honour, have I grudged the great labour, pains, and expense of seeking out their portraits, which I have placed at the head of their lives. And for the greater satisfaction of many friends not of our profession, who are yet devoted lovers of art, I have included in a compendium the greater part of the works of those who are still living and are worthy to be for ever renowned on account of their abilities. For that scruple which formerly restrained me can have no place here in the opinion of any thoughtful reader, since I deal with no works save those that are excellent and worthy of praise. And this may perchance serve as a spur to make every craftsman continue to labour worthily and advance unceasingly from good to better, insomuch that he who shall write the rest of the history may be able to give it more grandeur and majesty, having occasion to describe those rarer and more perfect works which began from time to time through the desire of immortality, and finished by the loving care of intellect so divine, the world in days to come shall see issuing from your hands. And the young men who follow with their studies, incited by hope of glory, if hope of gain has not enough force, may perchance be inspired by such an example to attain to excellence. And to the end that this work may prove to be in every way complete, and that there may be no need to seek anything outside its pages, I have added a great part of the works of the most celebrated craftsmen of antiquity, both Greek and of other nations, whose memory has been preserved down to our own day by Pliny and other writers, without whose pens they would have been buried, like many others, in eternal oblivion. And this consideration also may perchance increase the willingness of man in general to labor valiantly, and may impel and inspire us all, as we behold the nobility and greatness of our art, and how she has always been prized and rewarded by all nations, and particularly by the most lofty minds and the most powerful princes, to leave the world adorned by works infinite in number and unsurpassed in excellence, whence, rendered beautiful by us, it may give to us that rank which it has given to those ever marvellous and celebrated spirits. Accept then, with a friendly mind, these my labours which, whatever they may be, have been lovingly carried to conclusion by me for the glory of art and for the honour of her craftsmen, and take them as a sure token and pledge of my heart, which is desirous of nothing more ardently than of your greatness and glory, in which, seeing that I also have been received by you into your company, for which I render my thanks to you and congratulate myself not a little on my own account, I shall always consider myself in a certain sense a participator. End of section 20. Recording by Xiaoyan Arrowsmith.
Section 21 of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois-Doyle. Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6, by Giorgio Vasari. Translated by Gaston C. de VERE. Section 21. Life of Domenico Beccafumi of Siena, painter and master of casting. That same quality, the pure gift of nature, which has been seen in Giotto and in some others among those painters of whom we have spoken hitherto, has been revealed most recently in Domenico Beccafumi, the painter of Siena, in that he, while guarding some sheep for his father, Baccio, the laborer of the Sienese citizen Lorenzo Beccafumi, was observed to practice his hand by himself, child as he was, in drawing sometimes on stones and sometimes in other ways. It happened that the said Lorenzo saw him one day drawing various things with a pointed stick on the sand of a small stream, where he was watching his little charges, and he asked for the child from his father, meaning to employ him as his servant, and at the same time to have him taught. The boy, therefore, who was then called Perino, having been given up by his father Baccio to Lorenzo, was taken to Siena, where Lorenzo caused him for a while to spend all the spare time that he had after his household duties in the workshop of a painter, who was his neighbor. This painter, who was no great craftsman, caused Perino to learn all that he could not teach him himself from designs by eminent painters that he had in his possession, of which he availed himself for his own purposes, as those masters are wont to do who are not very able in design. Exercising his hand, therefore, in this manner, Perino gave promise of being destined to become an excellent painter. During this time, Pietro Perugino, then a famous painter, came to Siena, where, as he had been related, he painted 2 altarpieces, and his manner pleased Domenico greatly, so that he set himself to study it and to copy those altarpieces, and no long time passed before he had caught that manner. Then, after the chapel of Michelangelo and the works of Raffaello da Urbino had been thrown open in Rome, Domenico, who desired nothing so much as to learn, and knew that he was losing his time in Siena, took leave of Lorenzo Beccafumi, from whom he had acquired the family name of Beccafumi, and made his way to Rome. There he placed himself under a painter who gave him board and lodging, and executed many works in company with him, giving his attention at the same time to studying the works of Michelangelo, Raffaello, and other eminent masters, and the marvelous statues and sarcophagi of antiquity. Not a long time passed, therefore, before he became a bold draftsman, fertile in invention, and a very pleasing colorist. But during this period, which did not exceed 2 years, he did nothing worthy of record, save a facade in the Borgo, with an escutcheon of Pope Julius II in color. Meanwhile, there had been brought to Siena by a merchant of the Spanacchi family, as will be related in the proper place, the painter Giovanni Antonio de Vercelli, a young man of passing good ability, who was much employed, particularly in making portraits from life by the gentlemen of that city, which has always been the friend and patron of all men of talent. Domenico, who was very desirous of returning to his own country, having heard this news, made his way back to Siena. And when he saw that Giovanni Antonio was very well grounded in drawing, which he knew to be the essence of the excellence of a craftsman, not resting content with what he had done in Rome, he set himself up with the utmost zeal to follow him, devoting himself much to anatomy and to drawing nudes, which helped him so much that in a short time he began to be greatly esteemed in that most noble city. Nor was he beloved less for his goodness and his character than for his art, for the reason that, whereas Giovanni Antonio was coarse, licentious, and eccentric, being called Il Sodoma because he always mixed and lived with beardless boys, and answering willingly enough to that name, Domenico, on the other hand, was a pattern of good conduct and uprightness, living like a Christian and keeping very much to himself. But such persons as are called merry fellows and good companions are very often more esteemed by men than the virtuous and orderly. Most of the young men of Siena followed Sodoma, extolling him as a man of originality. And this Sodoma, being an eccentric and wishing to please the common herd, always kept at his house parrots, apes, dwarf monkeys, little Elba horses, a talking raven, barbs for running races, and other such like creatures, from which he had won such a name among the vulgar that he spoke of nothing but his follies. Sodoma then had painted with colors in fresco the facade of the house of Monsignor Agostino Bardi, and Domenico at the same time, in competition with him, painted the facade of a house of the Borghese, close to the Pastirella column near the Duomo, with which he took very great pains. Below the roof, in a frieze in chiaroscuro, he executed some little figures that were much extolled. And in the spaces between the 3 ranges of windows of travertine that adorn that palace, he painted many ancient gods and other figures in imitation of bronze, in chiaroscuro, and in color, which were more than passing good, although the work of Sodoma was more extolled. Both these facades were executed in the year 1512. Domenico afterwards painted for Saint Benedetto a seat of monks of Monte Oliveto without the Porta a Tufi, an altarpiece of Catherine of Siena in a building receiving the Stigmata, with a Saint Benedict standing on her right hand, and on her left hand a Saint Jerome in the habit of a cardinal, which altarpiece, being very soft in coloring and strong in relief, was much praised, as it still is. In the predella of this picture, likewise, he painted some little scenes in distemper with incredible boldness and vivacity, and with such facility of design that they could not be more graceful, and yet they have the appearance of having been executed without the slightest effort in the world. In one of these little scenes is the angel placing in the mouth of that same Saint Catherine part of the host consecrated by the priest. In another is Jesus Christ marrying her. In a third, she is receiving the habit from Saint Domenic, and there are other stories. For the church of Santo Martino, the same master painted a large altarpiece with Christ born and being adored by the Virgin, by Joseph, and by the shepherds, and above the hut is a most beautiful choir of angels dancing. In this work, which is much extolled by craftsmen, Domenico began to show to those who had some understanding that his works were painted with a different foundation from those of Sodoma. He then painted in fresco, in the great hospital, the Madonna visiting St. Elizabeth, in a manner very pleasing and very natural. And for the church of Santo Spirito, he executed an altarpiece of the Madonna holding in her arms the child, who is marrying the above-mentioned St. Catherine of Siena, and at the sides, St. Bernardino, St. Francis, St. Jerome, and St. Catherine, the Virgin Martyr, with St. Peter and St. Paul upon some marble steps in front. On the polished surface of which he counterfeited with great art some reflections of the color of their draperies. This work, which was executed with fine judgment and design, brought him much honor, as did also some little figures painted on the predella of the picture, in which is St. John baptizing Christ, a king causing the wife and children of St. Gismondo to be thrown into a well, St. Dominic burning the books of the heretics, Christ presenting to St. Catherine of Siena 2 crowns, one of roses and the other of thorns, and St. Bernardino of Siena preaching on the piazza of Siena to a vast multitude. Next, by reason of the fame of these works, there was allotted to Domenico an altarpiece that was to be placed in the Carmine, in which he had to paint a Saint Michael doing vengeance on Lucifer. And he, being full of fancy, set himself to think out a new invention in order to display his talent and the beautiful conceptions of his brain. And so, seeking to represent Lucifer and his followers driven for their pride from heaven to the lowest depths of hell, he began a shower of nude figures raining down, which is very beautiful, although, from his having taken too great pains with it, it appears, if anything, rather confused. This altarpiece, which remained unfinished, was taken after the death of Domenico to the great hospital and placed at the top of some steps near the high altar, where it is still regarded with marvel on account of some very beautiful foreshortenings in the nudes. In the Carmine, where this picture was to have been set up, was placed another, in the upper part of which is counterfeited a God, the Father, above the clouds, with many angels round him, painted with marvelous grace. And in the center of the picture is the angel Michael in armor flying and pointing to Lucifer, whom he has driven to the center of the earth, where there are burning buildings, rugged caverns, and a lake of fire, with angels in various attitudes, and nude figures of lost souls who are swimming with different gestures of agony in that fire. All this is painted with such beauty and grace of manner that it appears that this marvelous work, in its thick darkness, is illuminated by the fire, wherefore it is held to be a rare picture. Baldassare Peruzzi of Siena, an excellent painter, could never have his fill of praising it, and I myself one day that I saw it uncovered in his company, while passing through Siena, was struck with astonishment by it, as I also was by the 5 little scenes that are in the predella painted with distemper in a judicious and beautiful manner. For the nuns of Ognissanti, in the same city, Domenico painted another altarpiece, in which is Christ on high in the heavens, crowning the glorified Virgin, and below them are St. Gregory, St. Anthony, St. Mary Magdalene, and St. Catherine, the Virgin Martyr. And in the predella, likewise, are some very beautiful little figures executed in distemper. In the house of Signor Marcello Agostini Domenico painted some very lovely works in fresco on the ceiling of an apartment, which has 3 lunettes on each main side and 2 at each end, with a series of friezes that go right round. The center of the ceiling is divided into 2 quadrangle compartments. In the first, where a silken arras is counterfeited as upheld by the ornament, there may be seen, as if woven upon it, Scipio Africanus, restoring the young woman untouched to her husband, and the other is the celebrated painter Zeuxis, who was copying several nude women in order to paint his picture, which was to be placed in the temple of Juno. In one of the lunettes, painted with little figures, only about half a braccio high, but very beautiful, are 2 Roman brothers, who, having been enemies, became friends for the public good and for the sake of their country. In that which follows is Torquatus, who, in order to observe the laws, when his son had been condemned to lose his eyes, causes one of his sons and one of his own to be put out. In the next is the petition of who, after hearing the recital of his crimes against his country and the Roman people, is put to death. In the lunette beside that one is the Roman people deliberating on the expedition of Scipio to Africa. The next to this, in another lunette, is an ancient sacrifice crowded with a variety of most beautiful figures, with a temple drawn in perspective, which has no little relief. For in that field Domenico was a truly excellent master. In the last is Cato, killing himself after being overtaken by some horsemen that are most beautifully painted here. And in the recesses of the lunettes also are some little scenes very well finished. The excellence of this work was the reason that Domenico was recognized as a rare painter by those who were then governing, and was commissioned to paint the vaulting of a hall in the palace of the Signory, to which he devoted all the diligence, study, and effort of which any man is capable, in order to prove his worth and to adorn that celebrated building of his native city, which was honoring him so much. This hall, which is 2 squares long and 1 square wide, has the ceiling made not with lunettes, but after the manner of a groined vaulting. Wherefore Domenico executed the compartments in painting, thinking that this would give the best result, with friezes and cornices overlaid with gold, and all so beautifully that without any stucco work or other ornaments, they are so well painted and so graceful that they appear to be really in relief. On each of the 2 ends of this hall, there is a large picture with a historical scene, and on each main wall there are 2, one on either side of an octagon, and thus the pictures are 6 and the octagons 2, and each of the latter is a scene. At each corner of the vaulting, where the rib is, there is drawn a round compartment which extends half on one wall and half on the other, so that these compartments, being divided by the ribs of the vaulting, form 8 spaces, and each of which are large seated figures, representing distinguished men who have defended their republic and have observed her laws. The highest part of the surface of the vaulting is divided into 3 parts, in such a manner as to form a circular compartment in the center, immediately above the octagons, and 2 square compartments over those on the walls. In one of the octagons, then, is a woman with some children round, who holds a heart in her hand, representing the love that men owe to their country. In the other octagon is another woman, with an equal number of children, as a symbol of civic concord. And these are one on either side of a justice that is in the circle, with the sword and scales in her hands, and seen from below in such bold foreshortening that it is a marvel. For at the feet she is dark, both in drawing and in color, and about the knees she becomes lighter, and so continues little by little towards the torso, the shoulders, and the arms, until she rises into a celestial splendor at the head, which makes it appear as if that figure dissolves gradually in a mist. Wherefore it is not possible to imagine, much less to see, a more beautiful figure than this one or one executed with greater judgment and art, among all that were ever painted, to be seen in foreshortening from below. As for the stories, in the first, at the end of the hall and on the left hand as one enters, are Lepidus and Fulvius Flaccus, the censors, who, after being an enmity with one another, as soon as they became colleagues in the office of the censorship, laid aside their private hatred for the good of their country, and acted in that office like the closest friends. And Domenico painted them on their knees, embracing each other, with many figures around them, and with a most beautiful prospect of buildings and temples drawn in perspective, so ingeniously and so well that one may see in them what a master of perspective was Domenico. On the next wall there follows a picture with the story of the dictator Postumius Tiburtius, who, having left his only son at the head of his army in place of himself, commanding him that he should do nothing else but guard the camp, put him to death for having been disobedient, and having with a fair occasion attacked the enemy and gained a victory. In this scene, Domenico painted Postumius as an old man with a shaven face, with the right hand on his axe, and with the left showing to the army his son lying dead upon the ground, and depicted very well in foreshortening. And below this picture, which is most beautiful, is an inscription very well composed. In the octagon that follows, in the center of the wall, is the story of Spurius Cassius, whom the Roman Senate, suspecting that he was plotting to become king, caused to be beheaded, and his house to be pulled down. And in this scene, the head, which is beside the executioner, and the body, which is on the ground in foreshortening, are very beautiful. In the next picture is the tribune Publius Mucius, who caused all his fellow tribunes who were conspiring with Spurius to become tyrants of their country to be burned. And here the fire that is consuming their bodies is painted very well and with great art. At the other end of the hall, in another picture, is the Athenian Codrus, who, having heard from the oracle that the victory would fall to that side whose king should be killed by the enemy, laid aside his robes, entered unknown among the enemy, and let himself be slain, thus giving the victory to his people by his own death. Domenico painted him seated, with his nobles round him, as he puts off his robes near a most beautiful round temple. And in the distant background of the picture he is seen dead, with his name in an epitaph below. Then, as one turns to the other long wall, opposite to the two pictures with the octagon in the center between them, in the first scene one finds Prince Zaleucus, who, in order not to break the law, caused one of his own eyes to be put out, and one of his sons. And here many are standing round him, praying him that he should not do that cruelty to himself and his son. And in the distance is his son offering violence to a maiden, and below is his name in an inscription. In the octagon that is beside that picture is the story of Marcus Manilius being hurled down from the Capitol. And the figure of the young Marcus, who is being thrown down from a kind of balcony, is painted so well in foreshortening, with the head downwards, that it seems to be alive, as also seem some figures that are below. In the next picture is Spurius Melius, who belonged to the equestrian order, and was killed by the tribune Servilius, because the people suspected that he was conspiring to become a tyrant of his country, which Servilius is seated, with many round him, and one who is in the center points to Spurius lying dead upon the ground, a figure painted with great art. Then in the circles at the corners, where there are the 8 figures mentioned above, are many men who have been distinguished for their defense of their country. In the first part is the famous Fabius Maximus, seated and in armor, and on the other side is Speusippus, prince of the Tegetai, who, being exhorted by a friend that he should rid himself of his rival and adversary, answered that he did not wish, at the bidding of his own private interest, to deprive his country of such a citizen. In the circle that is at the next corner in one part, there is the praetor Celius, who, for having fought against the advice and wish of the soothsayers, although he had won and had gained a victory, was punished by the Senate. And besides him sits Thrasybulus, who, with the aid of some friends, valorously slew 30 tyrants in order to free his country. Thrasybulus is an old man, shaven, with white locks, and has his name written beneath him, as have also all the others. In a circle at one corner of the lower end of the hall is the praetor Genutius Scipius, who, having had a bird with wings in the form of horns miraculously alight on his head, was told by the oracle that he would become king of his country, whereupon, although already an old man, he chose to go into exile, in order not to take away her liberty. And Domenico therefore painted a bird upon his head. Beside him sits Charondas, who, having returned from the country and having gone straightway into the Senate without disarming himself, in violation of a law which ordained that one who entered the Senate with arms should be put to death, killed himself on perceiving his error. In the second circle on the other side are Damon and Phintius, whose unexampled friendship is so well known, and with them is Dionysius, tyrant of Sicily. And beside these figures sits Brutus, who, from love of his country, condemned his 2 sons to death, because they were conspiring to bring the Tarquins back to their country. This work, then, so truly extraordinary, made known to the people of Siena the ability and worth of Domenico, who showed most beautiful art, judgment, and genius in all that he did. The first time that the Emperor Charles V came to Italy, it was expected that he would go to Siena, for he had declared such an intention to the ambassadors of that republic. Among other vast and magnificent preparations that were made for the reception of so great an emperor, Domenico fashioned a horse 8 braccia high, and in full relief, all of pasteboard and hollow within. The weight of that horse was supported by an armature of iron, and upon it was the statue of the emperor, armed in the ancient fashion with a sword in his hand. And below it were 3 large figures, vanquished by him, as it were, which also supported part of the weight, and the horse being in the act of leaping with the front legs high in the air, which 3 figures represented 3 provinces conquered and subdued by the emperor. In that work, Domenico showed that he was a master no less of sculpture than of painting, to which it must be added that he had placed the whole work upon a wooden structure 4 braccia high, with a number of wheels below it, which, being set in motion by men concealed within, caused the whole to move forward. The design of Domenico was that at the entry of His Majesty, this horse, having been set in motion, as has been described, should accompany him from the gate as far as the palace of the Signoria, and should then come to rest in the middle of the piazza. This horse, after being carried by Domenico so near completion that there only remained to gild it, was left in that condition, because His Majesty, after all, did not, at that time, go to Siena, but left Italy after being crowned at Bologna, and the work remained unfinished. But nonetheless, the art and the ingenuity of Domenico were recognized, and all men greatly praised the grandeur and excellence of that great structure, which stood in the office of works of the Duomo from that time until His Majesty, returning from his victorious enterprise in Africa, passed through Messina, and then Naples, Rome, and finally Siena, at which time Domenico's work was placed on the Piazza del Duomo to his great honor. The fame of the ability of Domenico being thus spread abroad, Prince Doria, who was with the court after seeing all the works by his hand that were in Siena, besought him that he should go to Genoa to work in his palace, where Perino del Vaga, Giovanni Antonio de Pordenone, and Girolamo da Treviso had worked. But Domenico could not promise that lord that he would go to serve him at that time, although he engaged himself for another time, for in those days he had set his hand to finishing a part of the marble pavement in the Duomo, which Duccio, painter of Siena, had formerly begun in a new manner of work. The figures and scenes were already in great part designed on the marble, the outlines being hollowed out with the chisel and filled with a black mixture, with ornaments of colored marble all around, and likewise the grounds for the figures. But Domenico, with fine judgment, saw that this work could be much improved, and he therefore took gray marbles, to the end that these, profiled with the chisel and placed beside the brilliancy of the white marble, might give the middle shades, and he found that in this way, with white and gray marble, pictures of stone could be made with great perfection, after the manner of chiaroscuro. Having then made a trial, the work succeeded so well in invention, in solidity of design, and in abundance of figures, that he made a beginning after this fashion with the grandest, the most beautiful, and the most magnificent pavement that had ever been made. And in the course of his life, little by little, he executed a great part of it. Round the high altar he made a border of pictures, in which, in order to follow the order of the stories begun by Duccio, he executed scenes from Genesis, namely Adam and Eve expelled from paradise and tilling the earth, the sacrifice of Abel, and that of Melchizedek. In front of the altar is a large scene with Abraham about to sacrifice Isaac, and this has round it a border of half-length figures carrying various animals, which they seem to be going to sacrifice. Descending the steps, one finds another large picture, which serves to accompany that above, and in it Domenico represented Moses receiving the laws from God on Mount Sinai, and below this is the scene when, having found the people worshipping the golden calf, he is seized with anger and breaks the tablets on which those laws were written. Below this scene, opposite to the pulpit and right across the church, is a frieze with a great number of figures, which is composed with so much grace and such design that it defies description. And in this is Moses, who, striking the rock in the desert, causes water to gush out and gives drink to his thirsty people. Here, along the whole length of the frieze, Domenico represented the stream of water, from which the people are drinking in various ways, with a vivacity so pleasing that it is almost impossible to imagine any effect more lovely or figures in more graceful and beautiful attitudes than are those in this scene, some stooping to the ground to drink, some kneeling before the rock that is spouting with water, some drawing it in vases, and others in cups, and others finally drinking with their hands. There are, moreover, some who are leading animals to drink, amid the great rejoicing of that people. And among other things, most marvelous is a little boy who has taken a little dog by the head and neck and plunges its muzzle into the water, in order to make it drink, after which the dog, having drunk, and not wishing to drink any more, shakes its head so naturally that it seems to be alive. In short, this frieze is so beautiful that for a work of that kind it could not be executed with greater art, seeing that the various kinds of shadows that may be seen in these figures are not merely beautiful but miraculous. And although the whole work, on account of the fantastic nature of its craftsmanship, is one of great beauty, this part is held to be the most beautiful and the best. Below the cupola, moreover, there is a hexagonal compartment, which is divided into 7 hexagons and 6 rhombs, of which hexagons Domenico finished 4 before he died, representing in them the stories and sacrifices of Elijah, and doing all this much at his leisure, because this work was as a school and a pastime for Domenico, nor did he ever abandon it altogether for his other works. While he was thus laboring now at this work, and now elsewhere, he painted a large altarpiece in oils, which is in Santo Francesco, on the right hand as one enters into the church, containing Christ descending in glory to the limbo of hell, in order to deliver the Holy Fathers, wherein, among many nudes, is a very beautiful Eve, and a thief who is behind Christ with the cross is a very well executed figure, while the cavern in limbo and the demons and fires of that place are fantastic to marvel. And since Domenico was of the opinion that pictures painted in distemper preserve their freshness better than those painted in oils, saying that it seemed to him that the works of Luca da Cortona and Pola Giulio and of the other masters who painted in oils in those days had suffered from age more than those of Fra Giovanni, Fra Filippo, Benozzo, and others before their time who painted in distemper. For this reason, I say, having to paint an altarpiece for the company of Saint Bernardino on the Piazza di Santo Francesco, he resolved to do it in distemper. And in this way he executed it excellently well, painting in it Our Lady with many saints. In the predella, which is very beautiful and painted by him likewise in distemper, he depicted St. Francis receiving the stigmata, St. Anthony of Padua, who, in order to convert some heretics, performs the miracle of the ass, which makes obeisance before the sacred host, and St. Bernardino of Siena, who is preaching to the people of his city on the Piazza dei Signori. And on the walls of this company also he painted 2 stories of Our Lady in fresco, in competition with some others that Sodoma had executed in the same place. In one, he represented the visitation of St. Elizabeth, and in the other, the passing of Our Lady, with the apostles all around. And both of these are much extolled. Finally, after having been long expected in Genoa by Prince Doria, Domenico made his way there, but with great reluctance, being a man who was accustomed to a life of peace and contented with that which his wants required and nothing more. Beside which, he was not much used to making journeys, for the reason that having built himself a little house in Siena and having also a vineyard a mile beyond the Porta Camollia, which he cultivated with his own hand as a recreation, going there often, it was a long time since he had gone far from Siena. Having then arrived in Genoa, he painted a scene there beside that of Pordenone, in which he succeeded very well, and yet not in such a manner that it could be counted among his best works. But since the ways of the court did not please him, being used to a life of freedom, he did not stay very willingly in that place, and indeed appeared as if he were stupefied. Wherefore, having come to the end of that work, he sought leave of the prince and set out to return home. And passing by Pisa, in order to see that city, he met with Battista de Cervellera, and was shown all the most noteworthy things in the city, and in particular the altarpiece of Sogliani and the pictures that are in the recess behind the high altar of the Duomo. Meanwhile, Sebastiano del Seta, the warden of works of the Duomo, having heard from Cervellera of the qualities and abilities of Domenico, and being desirous to finish the work so long delayed by Giovanni Antonio Sogliani, allotted 2 of the pictures for that recess to Domenico, to the end that he might execute them at Siena and send them finished to Pisa. And so it was done. In one is Moses, who, having found that the people had sacrificed to the golden calf, is breaking the tablets. And in this Domenico painted some nudes that are figures of great beauty. In the other is the same Moses, with the earth opening and swallowing up a part of the people. And in this also are some nudes killed by flaming thunderbolts, which are marvelous. These pictures, when taken to Pisa, led to Domenico painting 4 pictures for the front of that recess, namely 2 on each side, of the 4 evangelists, which were 4 very beautiful figures. Whereupon Sebastiano della Seta, who saw that he had been served quickly and well, commissioned Domenico, after these pictures, to paint the altarpiece of one of the chapels in the Duomo, Sogliani having by that time painted 4. Settling in Pisa, therefore, Domenico painted in that altarpiece Our Lady in the sky with the child in her arms, upon some clouds supported by some little angels, with many saints, both male and female, below, all executed passing well, but yet not with that perfection which marked the pictures described above. But he, excusing himself for this to many of his friends, and particularly on one occasion to Giorgio Vasari, said that since he was away from the air of Siena and from certain comforts of his home, he did not seem to be able to do anything. Having therefore returned home, determined that he would never again go away to work elsewhere, he painted for the nuns of Santo Paolo, near Santo Marco, an altarpiece in oils of the Nativity of Our Lady, with some nurses and St. Anne in a bed that is foreshortened and represented as standing within a door. And in a dark shadow is a woman who is drying clothes without any other light but that which comes from the blaze of the fire. In the predella, which is full of charm, there are 3 scenes in distemper: the presentation of the Virgin at the temple, her marriage, and the adoration of the Magi. In the Mercanzia, a tribunal in that city, the officials have a little altarpiece which they say was painted by Domenico when he was young. It is very beautiful, and it contains in the center a St. Paul seated, and on one side his conversion in little figures, and on the other side the scene of his beheading. Finally, Domenico was commissioned to paint the great recess of the Duomo, which is at the end behind the high altar, and in this he first made a decoration of stucco with foliage and figures, all with his own hand, and 2 victories in the vacant spaces in the semicircle, which the decoration was in truth a very rich and beautiful work. Then in the center he painted in fresco the Ascension of Christ into heaven. And from the cornice downwards he painted 3 pictures divided by columns in relief and executed in perspective. In the middle picture, which has above it an arch in perspective, are Our Lady, St. Peter, and St. John. And in the spaces at the sides are 10 apostles, 5 on each side, all in various attitudes and gazing at Christ, who is ascending into heaven. And above each of the 2 pictures of the apostles is an angel in foreshortening, the 2 together representing those 2 angels who, after the ascension, declared that he had risen into heaven. This work is certainly admirable, but it would have been even more so if Domenico had given beautiful expressions to the heads. As it is, they have something in the expressions that is not very pleasing, and it appears that in his old age he adopted for his countenances an expression of terror, by no means agreeable. This work, I say, if there had been any beauty in the heads, would have been so beautiful that there would have been nothing better to be seen. But in this matter of the expressions of the heads, in the opinion of the people of Siena, Sodoma was superior to Domenico, for the reason that Sodoma made them much more beautiful, although those of Domenico had more design and greater force. And in truth, the manner of the heads in these our arts is of no little importance, and by painting them with graceful and beautiful expressions, many masters have escaped the censure that they might have incurred for the rest of their work. This was the last work in painting executed by Domenico, who, having taken it into his head in the end to work in relief, began to give his attention to casting in bronze, and went so far with this that he executed, although with extraordinary labor, 6 angels of bronze in round, little less than life-size, for the 6 columns nearest the high altar of the Duomo. These angels, which are very beautiful, are holding tazze, or rather little basins which support candelabra containing lights, and in the last of them he acquitted himself so well that he was very highly praised for them. Whereupon, growing in courage, he made a beginning with figures of the 12 apostles, which were to be placed on the columns lower down, where there are now some of marble, old, and in a bad manner. But he did not continue them, for he did not live long after that. And since he was a man of infinite ingenuity and succeeded well in everything, he engraved wood blocks by himself in order to make prints in chiaroscuro, and there are to be seen prints of 2 apostles engraved by him excellently well, of which we have one in our book of drawings, together with some sheets drawn divinely by his hand. He also engraved copper plates with burin, and he executed with aquafortis some very fanciful little stories of alchemy, in which Jove and the other gods, wishing to congeal Mercury, placed him bound in a crucible, and Vulcan and Pluto make fire around him. But when they think that he must be fixed, Mercury flies away and goes off in smoke. Domenico, in addition to the works described above, executed many others of no great importance, pictures of the Madonna and other such like chamber pictures, such as a Madonna that is in the house of the Chevalier Donati, and a picture in distemper in which Jove changes himself into a shower of gold and rains into the lap of Danae. Piero Cantanai likewise has a round picture in oils of a very beautiful Virgin by the hand of the same master. He also painted a most beautiful bier for the Confraternity of St. Lucia, and likewise another for that of St. Antonio. Nor should anyone be astonished that I make mention of such works, for the reason that they are beautiful to marvel, as all know who have seen them. Finally, having come to the age of 65, he hastened the end of his life by toiling all by himself day and night at his castings in metal, polishing them himself without calling in any assistance. He died then on the 18th of May, 1549, and was given burial by his dearest friend, the goldsmith Giuliano, in the Duomo, where he had executed so many rare works. And he was carried to the tomb by all the craftsmen of his city, which recognized even then the great loss that she had suffered in the death of Domenico, and now, as she admires his works, recognizes it more than ever. Domenico was an orderly and upright person, fearing God and studious in his art, although solitary beyond measure. Wherefore he well deserved to be honorably celebrated by his fellow citizens of Siena, who have always won great praise by their attention to noble studies and to poetry, with verses both in Latin and in the vulgar tongue. End of section 21. Section 22 of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois-Doyle. Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6, by Giorgio Vasari. Translated by Gaston du C. de VERE. Section 22. Life of Giovanni Antonio Lappoli, painter of Arezzo. Rarely does it happen that from an old stock there fails to sprout some good shoot, which, growing with time, revives and reclothes with leaves that desolate stem, and reveals with its fruits, to those who taste them, the same savor that was once known in the ancient tree. And that this is true is proved by the present life of Giovanni Antonio, who at the death of his father Matteo, who was a painter of passing good repute in his day, was left with a good income under the guardianship of his mother, and lived thus up to the age of 12. Having come to that period of his life, and not caring to choose any other pursuit than that of painting, to which he was drawn, besides other reasons, by a wish to follow the footsteps of his father in that art, Giovanni Antonio began to learn the first rudiments of design under Domenico Piccori, a painter of Arezzo, who had been, together with his father Matteo, a disciple of Clemente, and who was his first master. Then, after having been some time with him, desiring to make greater proficience than he was making under the discipline of that master and in that place where he was not able to learn by himself, although he had a strong natural inclination, he turned his thoughts towards the idea of settling in Florence. To this intention, not to mention that he was left alone by the death of his mother, fortune was favorable enough, for a young sister that he had was married to Leonardo Ricoveri, one of the first and richest citizens that there were at the time in Arezzo, and so he went off to Florence. There, among the works of many, he saw the manner of Andrea del Sarto and of Jacopo da Pontormo pleased him more than that of all the others who had worked at painting in that city. Wherefore he resolved to place himself under one of those two, and was hesitating as to which of them he should choose as his master, when there were uncovered the Faith and Charity painted by Pontormo over the portico of the Nunziata in Florence, and he became fully determined to go to work under Pontormo, thinking that his manner was so beautiful that it might be expected that Jacopo, who was still a young man, was destined to surpass all the young painters of his own age, as indeed was the firm belief of everyone at the time. Lappoli, then, although he might have gone to work under Andrea, for the said reasons, attached himself to Pontormo, under whose discipline he was forever drawing, spurred to incredible exertions out of emulation by two motives. One of these was the presence of Giovan Maria del Borgo, a San Sepolcro, who was studying design and painting under the same master, and who was always advising him for his own good, brought it about that he changed his manner and adopted the good manner of Pontormo. The other, and this spurred him more strongly, was the sight of Agnolo, who was called Bronzino, being much brought forward by Jacopo on account of his loving submissiveness and goodness, and the untiring diligence that he showed in imitating his master's works, not to mention that he drew very well, and acquitted himself in coloring in such a manner that he aroused hopes that he was destined to attain to that excellence and perfection which have been seen in him and still are seen in our own day. Giovanni Antonio, then, being desirous to learn and impelled by the reasons mentioned above, spent many months in making drawings and copies of the works of Jacopo da Pontormo, which were so well executed, so good, and so beautiful, that it is certain that if he had persevered, what with the assistance that he had from nature, his wish to become eminent, the force of competition, and the good manner of his master, he would have become most excellent. And to this some drawings in red chalk by his hand, which may be seen in our book, can bear witness. But pleasure, as may often be seen to happen, is in young men generally the enemy of excellence, and brings it about that their intellects are led astray. Wherefore, he who is engaged in the studies of any faculty, science or art, whatsoever, should have no relations save with those who are of the same profession and good and orderly besides. Giovanni Antonio, then, in order that he might be looked after, had to go to live in the house of one Ser Raffaello di Sandro, a lame chaplain in San Lorenzo, to whom he paid so much a year, and he abandoned in great measure the study of painting, for the reason that the priest was a man of the world, delighting in pictures, music, and other diversions, and many persons of talent frequented the rooms that he had at San Lorenzo. Among others, Antonio de Luca, a most excellent musician and performer on the lute, at that time a very young man, from whom Giovanni learned to play the lute. And although the painter Rosso and some others of the profession also frequented the same place, Lappoli attached himself rather to the others than to the men of his art, from whom he might have learned much, while at the same time amusing himself. Through these distractions, therefore, the love of painting, of which Giovanni Antonio had given proof, cooled off in great measure. But nonetheless, being the friend of Pier Francesco di Jacopo di Sandro, who was a disciple of Andrea del Sarto, he went sometimes with him to the Scalzo to draw the pictures and nudes from life. And no long time passed before he applied himself to coloring and executed pictures of Jacopo's, and then by himself some Madonnas and portraits from life, among which were that of the above-mentioned Antonio da Luca, and that of Ser Raffaello, which are very good. In the year 1523, the plague being in Rome, Perino del Vaga came to Florence, and he also settled down to lodge with Ser Raffaello del Zoppo, before Giovanni Antonio, having formed a straight friendship with him and having recognized the ability of Perino, there was reawakened in his mind the desire to attend to painting, abandoning all other pleasures, and he resolved, when the plague had ceased, to go with Perino to Rome. But this design was never fulfilled, for the plague having come to Florence, and at that very moment when Perino had finished the scene of the submersion of Pharaoh in the Red Sea, painted in the color of bronze in the chiaroscuro for Ser Raffaello, during the execution of which Lappoli was always present. They were forced, both the one and the other, to fly from Florence, in order not to lose their lives there. Thereupon Giovanni Antonio returned to Arezzo, and set himself, in order to pass the time, to paint on canvas the scene of the death of Orpheus, killed by the Bacchantes. He set himself, I say, to paint the scene in chiaroscuro, of the color of bronze, after the manner in which he had seen Perino paint the picture mentioned above. And when the work was finished, it brought him no little praise. He then set to work to finish an altarpiece that his former master Domenico Peccori had begun for the nuns of Santa Margherita, in which altarpiece, now to be seen in their convent, he painted an Annunciation. And he made 2 cartoons for 2 portraits from life, from the waist upwards, both very beautiful. One was Lorenzo di Antonio di Giorgio, at the time a pupil and a very handsome youth, and the other was Ser Piero Guazziesi, who was a convivial person. The plague having finally somewhat abated, Cipriano di Aguirre, a rich man of Arezzo, who in those days had caused a chapel with ornaments and columns of grey stone to be built in the abbey of San Fiore at Arezzo, allotted the altarpiece of Giovanni Antonio at the price of 100 crowns. Meanwhile, Rosso passed through Arezzo on his way to Rome, and lodged with Giovanni Antonio, who was very much his friend. And hearing of the work that he had undertaken to do, he made, at the request of Lappoli, a very beautiful little sketch full of nudes, whereupon Giovanni Antonio, setting his hand to the work and imitating the design of Rosso, painted in that altarpiece the Visitation of St. Elizabeth, and in the lunette above it a God the Father and some children, copying the draperies and all the rest from life. And when he had brought it to completion, he was much praised and commended for it, and above all for some heads copied from life, painted in a good manner, and with much profit to himself. Then, recognizing that if he wished to make greater proficience in his art, he must take his leave of Arezzo, he determined, after the plague had ceased entirely in Rome, to go to that city, where he knew that Perino, Rosso, and many others of his friends had already returned and were employed in a number of important works. While of this mind, a convenient occasion of going there presented itself to him, for there arrived in Arezzo Paolo Valdambrini, the secretary of Pope Clement VII, who, in returning from France in great haste, passed through Arezzo in order to see his brothers and nephews. And when Giovanni Antonio had gone to visit him, Paolo, who was desirous that there should be in his native city of Arezzo men distinguished in all the arts, who might demonstrate the genius which that air and that sky give to those who were born there, exhorted him, although there was not much need for exhortation, that he should go in his company to Rome, where he would obtain for him every convenience to enable him to attend to the studies of his art. Having therefore gone with Paolo to Rome, he found there Perino, Rosso, and others of his friends, and besides this, he was able by means of Paolo to make the acquaintance of Giulio Romano, Sebastiano Veneziano, and Francesco Mazzuoli of Parma, who arrived in Rome about this time. This Francesco, delighting to play the lute and therefore conceiving a great affection for Giovanni Antonio and consorting continually with him, brought it about that Lappoli set himself with great zeal to draw and paint and to profit by the good fortune that he had enjoyed in being the friend of the best painters that there were in Rome at that time. And he had already carried almost to completion a picture containing a Madonna of the size of life, which Paolo wished to present to Pope Clement in order to make Lappoli known to him, when, as fortune would have it, who often sets herself in opposition to the designs of mankind, there took place on the 6th of May, in the year 1527, the accursed sack of Rome. On that miserable day, Paolo galloped on horseback, and Giovanni Antonio with him, to the Porta di San Spirito in the Trastevere, in order to prevent the soldiers of Bourbon for a time from entering that gate. And there Paolo was killed, and Lappoli was taken prisoner by the Spaniards. And in a short time, everything being given over to sack, the picture was lost, together with the designs executed in the chapel, and all that poor Giovanni Antonio possessed. He, after having been much tormented by the Spaniards to induce him to pay a ransom, escaped in his shirt one night with some other prisoners, and after suffering desperate hardships and running in great danger of his life because the roads were not safe, finally made his way to Arezzo, where he was received by Giovanni Pilastra, a man of great learning, who was his uncle. But he had all that he could do to recover himself, so broken was he by terror and suffering. Then, in the same year, there came upon Arezzo the Great Plague, in which 400 persons died every day, and Giovanni Antonio was forced once more to fly, all in despair and very loath to go, and to stay for some months out of the city. But finally, when the pestilence had abated to such an extent that people could begin to mix together, a certain Frau Guaspari, a conventual friar of St. Francis, who was then guardian of their convent in that city, commissioned Giovanni Antonio to paint the altarpiece of the high altar in that church for 100 crowns, stipulating that he should represent in it the adoration of the Magi. Whereupon Lappoli, hearing that Rosso, having also fled from Rome, was at Borgo a San Sepolcro, and was there executing an altarpiece for the company of San Croce, went to visit him, and after showing him many courtesies and causing some things to be brought for him from Arezzo, of which he knew him to stand in need, since he had lost everything in the sack of Rome, he obtained for himself from Rosso a very beautiful design of the above-mentioned altarpiece that he had to paint for Fra Guasperi. And when he returned to Arezzo, he set his hand to work, and finished it within a year from the day of the commission, according to the agreement, and that so well that he was very highly praised for it. That design of Rosso's passed afterwards into the hands of Giorgio Vasari, and from him to the very reverend Don Vincenzio Borghini, director of the Hospital of the Innocenti in Florence, who has it in his book of drawings by various painters. Not long afterwards, having become surety for Rosso to the amount of 300 crowns in the matter of some pictures that he said Rosso was to paint in the Madonna della Lagrime, Giovanni Antonio found himself in a very evil pass, for Rosso went away without finishing the work, as has been related in his life, and Lappoli was constrained to restore the money. And if his friends had not helped him, and particularly Giorgio Vasari, who valued at 300 crowns the part that Rosso had left finished, Giovanni Antonio would have been little less than ruined in his effort to do honor and benefit to his native city. These difficulties over, Lappoli painted an altarpiece in oils containing the Madonna, St. Bartholomew, and St. Matthew, at the commission of Abbot Camiani at Bibbiena, for a chapel in the lower church of Santa Maria del Sasso, a seat of the preaching friars in the Casentino, and he acquitted himself very well, counterfeiting the manner of Rosso. And this was the reason that a confraternity at Bibbiena afterwards caused him to paint on a banner for carrying the processions a nude Christ with the cross on his shoulder, who is shedding blood into the chalice, and on the other side, an Annunciation, which was one of the best things that he ever did. In the year 1534, Duke Alessandro de' Medici, being expected in Arezzo, the Aretines, with Luigi Guicciardini, the commissary in that city, wishing to honor the Duke, ordained that 2 comedies should be performed. The charge of arranging one of those festivals was in the hands of a company of the most noble young men in the city, who called themselves the Umidi. And the preparations and the scenery for this comedy, which had for its subject the Intronati of Siena, were made by Niccolò Soggi, who was much extolled for them, and the comedy was performed very well and with infinite satisfaction to all who saw it. The festive preparations for the other were executed in competition by another company of young men, likewise noble, who called themselves the Company of the Infi Amati, and they, in order to be praised no less than the Umidi, performed a comedy by Giovanni Pilastri, a poet of Arezzo, under his management, and entrusted the making of the scenery to Giovanni Antonio, who acquitted himself consummately well, and thus their comedy was performed with great honor to that company and to the whole city. Nor must I pass over a lovely notion of that poet's, who was certainly a man of beautiful ingenuity. While the preparations for these and other festivals were in progress, on many occasions the young men of the 2 companies, out of rivalry and for various other reasons, had come to blows, and several disputes had arisen. Wherefore Pilastri arranged a surprise, keeping the matter absolutely secret, which was as follows. When all the people, with the gentlemen and their ladies, had assembled in the place where the comedy was to be performed, 4 of those young men who had come to blows with one another in the city on other occasions, dashing out with naked swords and cloaks wound round their arms, began to shout on the stage and to pretend to kill one another. and the first of them to be seen rushed out with one temple as it were smeared with blood, crying out, "Come forth, traitors!" At which uproar all the people rose to their feet. Men began to lay hands on their weapons, and the kinsmen of the young men, who appeared to be giving each other fearful thrusts, ran towards the stage, when he, who had come out first, turning towards the other young men, said, "Hold your hands, gentlemen, and sheath your swords, for I have taken no harm, and although we are at daggers drawn, and you believe that the play will not be performed, yet it will take place, and I, wounded as I am, will now begin the prologue." And so after this jest, by which all the spectators and actors themselves, only expecting the forementioned above, were taken in, the comedy was begun and played so well that afterwards, in the year 1540, when the Lord Duke Cosimo and the Lady Duchess Leonora were in Arezzo, Giovanni Antonio had to prepare the scenery anew on the Piazza del Vescovado, and have it performed before their excellencies. And even as the performers had given satisfaction on the first occasion, so at that time they gave so much satisfaction to the Lord Duke that they were afterwards invited to Florence to perform at the next carnival. In these two scenic preparations, then, Lappoli acquitted himself very well, and he was very highly praised. He then made an ornament after the manner of a triumphal arch, with scenes in the color of bronze, which was placed about the altar of the Madonna della Chiavi. After a time, Giovanni Antonio settled in Arezzo, fully determined now that he had a wife and children, to go roaming no more, and living on his income and on the offices that the citizens of that city enjoy. And so he continued without working much. Not long, indeed, after these events, he sought to obtain the commissions for the two altarpieces that were to be painted in Arezzo, one for the church in company of San Rocco, and the other for the high altar of San Domenico. But he did not succeed, for the reason that both these pictures were allotted to Giorgio Vasari, whose designs, among the many that were made, gave more satisfaction than any of the others. For the Company of the Ascension in that city, Giovanni Antonio painted on the banner for carrying in processions Christ in the act of resurrection, with many soldiers round the sepulchre, and his ascension into heaven with the Madonna surrounded by the 12 apostles, which was all executed very well and with diligence. At Castello della Pieve, he painted an altarpiece in oils of the Visitation of Our Lady, with some saints about her, and in an altarpiece that was painted for the Pieve a San Stefano, he depicted the Madonna and other saints, which two works Lappoli executed much better than the others that he had painted up to that time, because he had been able to see at his leisure many works in relief, and casts taken in gesso from the statues of Michelangelo and from other ancient works, and brought by Giorgio Vasari to his house at Arezzo. The same master painted some pictures of Our Lady, which are dispersed throughout Arezzo and other places, and a Judith who is placing the head of Holofernes in a basket held by her serving woman, which now belongs to Monsignor Bernardetto Minerbetti, Bishop of Arezzo, who loved Giovanni Antonio much, as he loves all other men of talent, and received from him, besides other things, a young St. John the Baptist in the desert, almost wholly naked, which is held dear by him, since it is an excellent figure. Finally, recognizing that perfection in this art consists in nothing else but seeking in good time to become rich in invention and to study the nude continually, and thus to render facile the difficulties of execution, Giovanni Antonio repented that he had not spent in the study of art the time that he had given to his pleasures, perceiving that what can be done easily in youth cannot be done well in old age. But although he was always conscious of his error, yet he did not recognize it fully until, having set himself to study when already an old man, he saw a picture in oils, 14 braccia long and 6 braccia and a half high, executed in 42 days by Giorgio Vasari, who painted it for the refectory of monks of the Abbey of San Fiore at Arezzo, in which work are painted the nuptials of Esther and King Ahasuerus, and there are in it more than 60 figures larger than life. Going therefore at times to see Giorgio at work, and staying to discourse with him, Giovanni Antonio said, "Now I see that continual study and work is what lifts men out of the laborious effort, and that our art does not come down upon us like the Holy Ghost. Giovanni Antonio did not work much in fresco, for the reason that the colors changed too much to please him. Nevertheless, there may be seen over the church of Morello a Pieta with 2 little naked angels by his hand, executed passing well. Finally, after having lived like a man of good judgment and one not unpracticed in the ways of the world, he fell sick of a most violent fever at the age of 60, in the year 1552, and died. A disciple of Giovanni Antonio was Bartolomeo Torri, the scion of a not ignoble family in Arezzo, who, making his way to Rome and placing himself under Don Giulio Clovio, a most excellent miniaturist, devoted himself in so thorough a manner to design and to the study of the nude, but almost of all to anatomy, that he became an able master, and was held to be the best draftsman in Rome. And it is not long since Don Silvano Razzi related to me that Don Gilo Clovio had told him in Rome, after having praised this young man highly, the very thing that has often declared to me, namely, that he had turned him out of his house for no other reason but his filthy anatomy, for he kept so many limbs and pieces of men under his bed and all over his rooms that they poisoned the whole house. Besides this, by neglecting himself and thinking that living like an unwashed philosopher, accepting no rule of life and avoiding the society of other men, was the way to become great and immortal, he ruined himself completely. For nature will not tolerate the unreasonable outrages that some men at times do to her. Having therefore fallen ill at the age of 25, Bartolomeo returned to Arezzo, in order to regain his health and to seek to build himself up again. But he did not succeed, for he continued his usual studies and the same irregularities, and in 4 months, a little after the death of Giovanni Antonio, he died and went to join him. The loss of this young man was an infinite grief to the whole city, for if had he lived, to judge from the great promise of his works, he was like to do extraordinary honor to his native place and to all Tuscany, and whoever sees any of the drawings that he made when still a mere lad, stands marveling at them and full of compassion for his untimely death. End of section 22. Section 23 of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dick Bourgeois-Doyle. Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6, by Giorgio Vasari. Translated by Gaston du de VERE. Section 23. Life of Niccolò Soggi, Painter. Among the many who were disciples of Pietro Perugino, there was not one, after Raffaello da Urbino, who was more studious or more diligent than Niccolò Soggi, whose life we are now about to write. This master was born in Florence, the son of Jacopo Soggi, a worthy person but not very rich, and in time he entered the service of Antonio del Monte in Rome, because Jacopo had a farm at Marciano in Val di Siena, and passing most of his time there, associated not a little with the same Antonio del Monte, their properties being near together. Jacopo, then perceiving that this son of his was much inclined to painting, placed him with Pietro Perugino, and in a short time, by means of continual study, he learned so much that it was not long before Pietro began to make use of him in his works, to great advantage of Niccolò, who devoted himself in such a manner to drawing in perspective and copying from nature that he afterwards became very excellent in both the one field and the other. Niccolò also gave much attention to making models of clay and wax, over which he laid draperies and soaked parchment, which was the reason that he rendered his manner so dry that he always held to the same as long as he lived, nor could he ever get rid of it for all the pains that he took. The first work that Niccolò executed after the death of his master Pietro was an altarpiece in oils for the Hospital for Women founded by Bonifacio Lupi in the Via San Gallo in Florence. That is, the side behind the altar, wherein is the angel saluting Our Lady, with the building drawn in perspective, in which there are arches and a groined vaulting rising above pilasters after the manner of Pietro. Then in the year 1512, after having executed many pictures of Our Lady for the houses of citizens and other little works such as are painted every day, hearing that great things were being done in Rome, he departed from Florence, thinking to make proficience in art and also to save some money, and went off to Rome. There, having paid a visit to the aforesaid Antonio del Monte, who was then a cardinal, he was not only welcomed warmly, but also straightway set to work in paint in those early days of the pontificate of Leo, on the facade of the palace where there is the statue of Maestro Pasquino, a great escutcheon of Pope Leo in fresco, between that of the Roman people and that of the cardinal. In that work, Niccolò did not acquit himself very well, for in painting some nude figures and others clothed that he placed there as ornaments for those escutcheons, he recognized that the study of models is bad for him who wishes to acquire a good manner. Thereupon, after the uncovering of that work, which did not prove to be that of excellence which many expected, Niccolò set himself to execute a picture in oils, in which he painted the martyr Saint Prassidia squeezing a sponge full of blood into a vessel, and he finished it with such diligence that he recovered, in part, the honor that he considered himself to have lost in painting the escutcheons described above. This picture, which was executed for the above-mentioned Cardinal del Monte, who was titular Saint Prassidia, was placed in the center of that church, over an altar beneath which is a well of the blood of holy martyrs. A beautiful idea, the picture alluding to the place where there was the blood of those martyrs. After this, Niccolò painted for his patron the cardinal another picture in oils, 3/4 of a braccio in height, of Our Lady with the child in her arms, St. John as a little boy, and some landscapes, all executed so well and with such diligence that the whole work appears to be done in miniature, and not painted, which picture, one of the best works that Niccolò ever produced, was for many years in the apartment of that prelate. Afterwards, when the cardinal arrived in Arezzo and lodged in the Abbey of San Fiore, a seat of the Black Friars of St. Benedict, in return for the many courtesies that were shown to him, he presented that picture to the sacristy of that place, in which it has been treasured ever since, both as a good painting and in memory of the cardinal. Niccolò himself went to the Cardinal of Arezzo, where he lived almost ever afterwards. At the time, he formed a friendship with the painter Domenico Piccori, who was then painting an altarpiece with the Circumcision of Christ for the Company of the Trinita. And such was the intimacy between them that Niccolò painted for Domenico in that altarpiece a building in perspective with columns and arches supporting a ceiling full of rosettes, according to the custom of those days, which was held at that time to be very beautiful. Niccolò also painted for the same Domenico a round picture of the Madonna with a multitude below, in oils and on cloth, for the baldachin of the Confraternity of Arezzo, which was burned, as has been related in the life of Domenico Piccori, during a festival that was held in San Francesco. Then, after having received the commission for a chapel in that same San Francesco, the second on the right hand as one enters the church, he painted there in distemper Our Lady, St. John the Baptist, St. Bernard, St. Anthony, St. Francis, and 3 angels in the air who are singing, with God the Father in a pediment, which were executed by Niccolò almost entirely in distemper, with the point of the brush. But since the work has almost all peeled off on account of the strength of the distemper, it was labor thrown away. Niccolò did this in order to try new methods. And when he had recognized that the true method was working in fresco, he seized the first opportunity and undertook to paint in fresco a chapel in San Agostino in that city, beside the door on the left hand as one enters the church. In this chapel, which was allotted to him by one Scamara, a master of furnaces, he painted a Madonna in the sky with a multitude beneath, and St. Donatus and St. Francis kneeling. But the best thing he did in this work was a St. Rocco at the head of the chapel. This work, giving great pleasure to Domenico Riccardi of Arezzo, who had a chapel in the church of the Madonna della Lagrima, he entrusted the painting of the altarpiece of that chapel to Niccolò, who was setting his hand to work, painted in it, with much care and diligence, the Nativity of Jesus Christ. And although he toiled a long time over finishing it, he executed it so well that he deserves to be excused for this, or rather merits infinite praise, for the reason that it is a most beautiful work. Nor would anyone believe with what extraordinary consideration he painted every least thing in it, and a ruined building near the hut, wherein are the infant Christ and the Virgin, is drawn very well in perspective. In the St. Joseph and some shepherds are many heads portrayed from life, such as Stagio Sassoli, a painter and the friend of Niccolò, and Peppino della Pieve, his disciple, who, if he had not died when still young, would have done very great honor both to himself and to his country. And the three angels in the air who are singing are so well executed that they would be enough by themselves to demonstrate the talent of Niccolò and the patience with which he labored at this work up to the very last. And no sooner had he finished it than he was requested by the men of the company of Santa Maria del Neve at Monte Sansovino to paint for that company an altarpiece wherein was to be the story of the snow, which falling on the site of Santa Maria Maggiore at Rome on the 5th of August was the reason of the building of that temple. Niccolò then executed an altarpiece for the above-mentioned company with much diligence, and afterwards he executed at Marciano a work in fresco that won no little praise. Now, in the year 1524, after Baldo Maggini had caused Antonio, the brother of Giuliano da San Gallo, to build the Madonna della Carcere in the town of Prato, a tabernacle of marble with 2 columns, architrave, cornice, and a quarter-round arch, Antonio resolved to bring it about that Baldo should give the commission for the picture which was to adorn that tabernacle to Niccolò, with whom he had formed a friendship when he was working in the palace of the above-mentioned Cardinal del Monte at Monte Sansovino. He presented him, therefore, to Baldo, who, although he had been minded to have it painted by Andrea del Sarto, as has been related in another place, resolved, at the entreaties and advice of Antonio, to allot it to Niccolò. And he, having set his hand to it, strove with all his power to make a beautiful work, but he did not succeed. For apart from diligence, there is no excellence of design to be seen in it, nor any other quality worthy of much praise, because his hard manner, with his labors over his models of clay and wax, almost always gave a laborious and displeasing effect to his work. And yet, with regard to the labors of art, that man could not have done more than he did, or shown more lovingness. And since he knew that none, for many years he could never bring himself to believe that others surpassed him in excellence. In this work, then, there is a God the Father who is sending down the crown of virginity and humility upon the Madonna by the hands of some angels who are round her, some of whom are playing various instruments. Niccolò made in the picture a portrait from life of Baldo, kneeling at the feet of Saint Ubaldo, the bishop, and on the other side he painted Saint Joseph, and those two figures are one on either side of the image of the Madonna, which worked miracles in that place. Niccolò afterwards painted a picture 3 braccia in height of the same Baldo Maggini from life, standing with the church of San Fabiano di Prato in his hand, which he presented to the chapter of the canons of the Pieve. And this Niccolò executed for that chapter, which in memory of the benefit received, caused the picture to be placed in the sacristy, an honor well deserved by that remarkable man, who with excellent judgment conferred benefits on that church, the principal church of his native city, and so renowned for the girdle of the Madonna, which is preserved there. This portrait was one of the best works that Niccolò ever executed in painting. It is also the belief of some that a little altarpiece that is in the company of San Pier Martire in the Piazza di San Domenico at Prato, in which are many portraits from life, is by the hand of the same Niccolò. But, in my opinion, even if this is true, it was painted by him before any of the other pictures above. After these works, Niccolò, under whose discipline Domenico Giuntalodi, a young man of excellent ability belonging to Prato, had learned the rudiments of the art of painting, although in consequence of having acquired the manner of Niccolò, he never became a great master in painting, as will be related, departed from Prato, and came to work in Florence. But having seen that the most important works in art were given to better and more eminent men than himself, and that his manner was not up to the standard of Andrea de Sarto, Pontormo, Rosso, and others, he made up his mind to return to Arezzo, in which city he had more friends, greater credit, and less competition. Which having done, no sooner had he arrived than he made known to Giuliano Bacci, one of the chief citizens of that place, a desire that he had in his heart, which was this, that he wished that Arezzo should become his country, and that therefore he would gladly undertake to execute some work which might maintain him for a time in the practice of his art, whereby he hoped to demonstrate to that city the nature of his talents. Whereupon Messer Giuliano, an ingenious man who desired that his native city should be embellished and should contain persons engaged in the arts, so went to work with the men then governing the company of the Nunziata, who in those days had caused a great vaulting to be built in their church with the intention of having it painted. That one arch of the wall surface of that vaulting was allotted to Niccolò, and it was proposed that he should be commissioned to paint the rest, if the first part, which he had to do then, should please the men of the aforesaid company. Having therefore set his hand to this work with great diligence, in 2 years Niccolò finished the half, but not more, of one arch, on which he painted the fresco The Tiburtine Sibyl, showing to the Emperor Octavian the Virgin in heaven and the infant Jesus Christ in her arms, and Octavian in reverent adoration. In the figure of Octavian he portrayed the above-mentioned Giuliano Bacci, and his pupil Domenico in a tall young man draped in red, and others of his friends in other heads. And, in a word, he acquitted himself in this work in such a manner that it did not displease the men of that company and the other men of that city. It is true, indeed, that everyone grew weary of seeing him take so long and toil so much over executing his works, but, notwithstanding all this, the rest would have been given to him to finish, if that had not been prevented by the arrival in Arezzo of the Florentine Rosso, a rare painter, to whom, after he had been put forward by the Aretine painter Giovanni Antonio Lappoli and Giovanni Polastra, as has been related in another place, much favor was shown in the rest of that work allotted. At which Niccolò felt such disdain that if he had not taken a wife the year before and had a son by her, so that he was settled in Arezzo, he would have departed straight away. However, having finally become pacified, he executed an altarpiece for the church of Sargiano, a place 2 miles distant from Arezzo, where there are Frati Zoccolanti, in which he painted the Assumption of Our Lady into heaven, with many little angels supporting her, and St. Thomas below receiving the girdle, while all around are St. Francis, St. Louis, St. John the Baptist, and St. Elizabeth, Queen of Hungary. In some of these figures, and particularly in some of the little angels, he acquitted himself very well, and so also in the predella. He painted some scenes with little figures which are passing good. He executed likewise in the convent of the nuns of the Murate, who belong to the same order in that city, a dead Christ with Marius, which is wrought with a high finish for a picture in fresco. In the Abbey of San Fiore, a seat of black friars behind the crucifix that is placed on the high altar, he painted in oils on a canvas Christ praying in the garden and the angel showing to him the chalice of the Passion and comforting him, which was certainly a work of no little beauty and excellence. And for the nuns of Saint Benedetto, of the order of Camaldoli, at Arezzo, on an arch above a door by which one enters the convent, he painted the Madonna, St. Benedict, and St. Catherine, a work which was afterwards thrown to the ground in order to enlarge the church. In the township of Marciano, in Val di Siena, where he passed much of his time, living partly on the revenues that he had in that place and partly on what he could earn there, Niccolò began an altarpiece of the Dead Christ and many other works with which he occupied himself for a time. And meanwhile, having with him the above-mentioned Domenico Giuntalodi of Prato, whom he loved as a son and kept in his house, he strove to make him excellent in the matters of art, teaching him so well how to draw in perspective, to copy from nature, and to make designs, that he was already becoming very able in all these respects, showing a good and beautiful genius. And this Niccolò did, besides being moved by the love and affection that he bore to that young man, in the hope of having one who might help him now that he was nearing old age, and might give him some return in his last years for so much labor and lovingness. Niccolò was, in truth, most loving with every man, true by nature, and much the friend of those who labored in order to attain to something in the world of art, and what he knew he taught to them with extraordinary willingness. No long time after this, when Niccolò had returned from Marciano to Arezzo and Domenico had left him, the men of the company of the Corpo di Cristo in that city had a commission to give for the painting of an altarpiece for the high altar of the church of San Domenico. Now Niccolò desiring to paint it, and likewise Giorgio Vasari, then a mere lad, the former did something which probably not many of the men of our art would do at the present day, which was as follows. Niccolò, who was one of the members of the above-mentioned company, perceiving that many were disposed to have it painted by Giorgio, in order to bring him forward, and that the young man had a very great desire for it, resolved, after remarking Giorgio's zeal, to lay aside his own desire and need to have the picture allotted by his companions to Giorgio, thinking more of the advantage that the young man might gain from the work than of his own profit and interest. And even as he wished, so exactly did the men of that company decide. In the meantime, Domenico Giuntalodi, having gone to Rome, found fortune so propitious that he became known to Don Martino, the ambassador of the King of Portugal, and went to live with him. And he painted for him a canvas with some 20 portraits from life, all of his followers and friends, with himself in the midst of them, engaged in conversation, which work so pleased Don Martino that he looked upon Domenico as the first painter in the world. Afterwards, Don Ferrante Gonzaga, having been made Viceroy of Sicily and desiring to fortify the towns of that kingdom, wished to have about his person a man who might draw and put down on paper for him all that he thought of from day to day. And he wrote to Don Martino that he should find for him a young man who might be both able and willing to serve him in this way, and should send him off as soon as possible. Don Martino, therefore, first sent to Don Ferrante some designs by the hand of Domenico, among which was a Colosseum engraved on copper by Girolamo Fagioli of Bologna for Antonio Salamanca, but drawn in perspective by Domenico, an old man in a child's go-cart drawn by the same hand and published in engraving, with letters that ran thus, Ancora imparo, and a little picture with the portrait of Don Martino himself. And shortly afterwards he sent Domenico, at the wish of the aforesaid lord Don Ferrante, who had been much pleased with the young man's works. Having then arrived in Sicily, there were assigned to Domenico an honorable salary, a horse, and a servant, all at the expense of Don Ferrante, and not long afterwards he was set to work on the walls and fortresses of Sicily, whereupon, abandoning his painting little by little, he devoted himself to something else, which for a time was more profitable to him. For, being an ingenious person, he made use of men who were well adapted to heavy labor, kept beasts of burden in the charge of others, and caused sand and lime to be collected and furnaces to be set up. And no long time had passed before he found that he had saved so much that he was able to buy offices in Rome to the extent of 2,000 crowns, and shortly afterwards some others. Then, after he had been made keeper of the wardrobe to Don Ferrante, it happened that his master was removed from the government of Sicily and sent to that of Milan, whereupon Domenico went with him, and working on the fortifications of that state, contrived, what with being industrious and with being something of a miser, to become very rich. And what is more, he came into such credit that he managed almost everything in that government. Hearing of this, Niccolò, who was at Arezzo, now an old man, needy and without any work to do, went to find Domenico in Milan, thinking that even as he had not failed Domenico when he was a young man, so Domenico should not fail him now, but should avail himself of his services, since he had many in his employ, and should be both able and willing to assist him in his poverty-stricken old age. But he found to his cost that the judgments of men, in expecting too much from others, are often deceived, and that the men who change their condition also change more often than not their nature and their will. For after arriving in Milan, where he found Domenico raised to such greatness that he had no little difficulty in getting speech of him, Niccolò related to him all his troubles, and then besought him that he should help him by making use of his services. But Domenico, not remembering or not choosing to remember with what lovingness he had been brought up by Niccolò, as if he had been his own son, gave him a miserably small sum of money and got rid of him as soon as he was able. And so Niccolò returned to Arezzo, very sore at heart, having recognized that with the labor and expense with which, as he thought, he had reared a son, he had formed one who was little less than an enemy. In order to earn his bread, therefore, he went about executing all the work that came to his hand, as he had done many years before, and he painted, among other things, a canvas for the commune of Monte San Sovino, containing the said town of Monte San Sovino, and a Madonna in the sky, with 2 saints at the sides, which picture was set up on an altar in the Madonna di Vertigli, a church belonging to the monks of the order of the Camaldoli, not far distant from the Monte, where it has pleased and still pleases our Lord daily to perform many miracles and to grant favors to those who recommend themselves to the Queen of Heaven. Afterwards, Julius III having been created supreme pontiff, Niccolò, who had been much connected with the house of Monte, made his way to Rome. Although he was an old man of 80, and having kissed the foot of his holiness, besought him that he should deign to make use of him in the buildings which were to be erected. So men said at the Monte, a place which the Lord Duke of Florence had given in fief to the pontiff, the Pope then, having received him warmly, ordained that the means to live in Rome should be given to him without exacting any sort of exertion from him. And in this manner Niccolò spent several months in Rome, drawing many antiquities to pass the time. Meanwhile, the Pope resolved to increase his native town of Monte San Sovino, and to make there, besides many ornamental works, an aqueduct, because that place suffered much from want of water. And Giorgio Vasari, who had orders from the Pope to cause those buildings to be begun, recommended Niccolò Soggi strongly to His Holiness, entreating him that Niccolò should be given the office of superintendent over those works, whereupon Niccolò went to Arezzo, filled with these hopes. But he had not been there many days, when, worn out by the fatigues and hardships of the world, and by the knowledge that he had been abandoned by him who should have been the last to forsake him, he finished the course of his life, and was buried at San Domenico in that city. Not long afterwards, Domenico Giuntellodi, Don Ferrante Gonzaga having died, departed from Milan with the intention of returning to Prato, and of passing the rest of his life there in repose. However, finding there neither relatives nor friends, and recognizing that Prato was no abiding place for him, he repented too late that he had behaved ungratefully to Niccolò, and returned to Lombardy to serve the sons of Don Ferrante. But no long time passed before he fell sick unto death, whereupon he made a will, leaving 10,000 crowns to his fellow citizens of Prato, to the end that they might buy property to that amount and form a fund wherewith to maintain continually at their studies a certain number of students from Prato, in the manner in which they maintained certain others, as they still do, according to the terms of another bequest. And this has been carried out by the men of that town of Prato, who, grateful for such a benefit, which in truth has been a very great one and worthy of eternal remembrance, have placed in their council chamber the image of Domenico, is that of one who has deserved well of his country. End of section 23. End of Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, Volume 6, by Giorgio Vasari, translated by Gaston du C. de VERE.